Welcome to the podcast that's dedicated to making you a faster cyclist, the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. I'm Coach Jonathan Lee, and you can see with us here in this Brady Bunch arrangement that we have on YouTube, or if you're listening to the podcast, down below me right here is Coach Chad Timmerman. How you doing, Chad?
I'm doing well. Hi, everybody.
And then we also have Cannondale and TrainerRoad's and Amber Pierce. How you doing, Amber?
I'm doing great. Hi, everyone.
And our CEO, Nate Pearson.
Hello.
And we are actually live on YouTube right now for the first time in quite some time, and it's first time testing something else. So bear with us if there are any sort of issues or anything else that come through. Constant improvement. We'll do better as it goes on. So don't worry about that. We are going to answer more of the cycling and triathlon related questions that you've submitted to us at trainerroad.com/podcast. Thank you so much for doing that, and we'll continue to constantly go through and read all those questions that you send to us and answer them every week. So we really do appreciate it. So first things first, we should probably mention, if you are on YouTube right now and you are watching live, giving this a thumbs up will help a lot, and then it'll make it so that other people can see this. And also, if you're listening to the podcast, please share as well. But this week, earlier on our YouTube channel, we launched a new feature, which was ramp test for group workouts, right, Nate?
We sure did. It was fun. We streamed it live on YouTube. Supposedly the sound was a little weird after like 15 minutes in. You should just watch and you'll understand.
Or don't.
Watch the volume low.
Watch without
least, right?
sound.
Yeah, not safe for work. Not safe for work.
Make sure you have your laptop open, but no one can see the screen, and just pump the volume up. Just so everyone can experience what we experienced.
Yeah, definitely do.
So what we have is a new feature where you can do group workouts, you can do a ramp test together. You can also see your live FTP. There's a little summary stats window in the lower left-hand corner. You click that open, you can see that open, or you can see your FTP tick up. Also, when you start the group workout, you can choose to either share the FTP with everyone and your watt kg at the end or not. So if you want to keep it private, you can. You just uncheck the little box. This is also in the solo workout for group work or for the ramp test, where you can see your FTP live at the same time. We had a whole bunch of fun on that video. We had 2,600 people in there live rooting us on and making fun of us. And that was
way more than I've ever
fun.
Cheering for me at any sort of race, right? Like way more, especially like
super
cheering
cool.
for just a few people. So
the other things before we get into more details on that we launched with that are improved audio controls. So now you can kind of tell which mic and speaker you have set up, because before it's hard. We kind of made it look like Zoom. And then also keyboard shortcuts for audio and video. So if you want to turn those on and off, you push A or V, which is pretty cool. And the next thing we're working on is getting it so you can have 11 people in the stream, and it is improved quality and stability. It's pretty cool. And yeah, so less resources on your computer. But what we have to do, because that was so successful, people actually like to watch us suffer, which I was surprised.
Yeah,
all a bunch of weirdos.
Weirdos
we
like
should
us.
do in 4 weeks. We have to do it again. I'm in short power build, high volume, adding extra volume. John, you're in the second phase of short power build, high volume.
Correct. Yeah, second loading phase. Yep. Mm-hmm.
I think we should retest in 4 weeks live. What do you think, everyone?
Yeah, I'm up for it. I'm up for it for sure. I think that a lot of people, from what I've seen so far, a lot of people are finding that it's like really helpful for them to get the most out of themselves, because that's one key thing. Like, so with the 2x8 or the 1x20, pacing is like a huge variable, right? And it's always hard to like nail that pacing. And even if you get really good at pacing, it's really easy to screw it up. And the ramp test removes that variable, right? So that's like super helpful. But one thing that you absolutely do have to do with the ramp test is make sure that you go deep. And I mean like really, really deep. Like you have to absolutely empty the tank. So I think that this will help with a lot of people on getting that extra out of themselves. It's motivating to have your friends there, or 2,600 people watching. You're welcome to live stream it like we did, and you can get some people there checking it out. So, but I think it'll help people really get the most out of themselves. You know, it's pretty exciting. If there's ever a workout to have people cheer, that's it. Sorry about that, Nate. But if there's ever a workout to have somebody cheer for you, that's it.
There's a slight delay, so I hear pauses, and then the pauses aren't really there. So I'm sorry, everyone. But the other thing, if you can't do it, if you don't have friends to do it with, There's the forum post inside about group workout ride sharing. But also, if you just watch the video on YouTube and do TrainerRoad, you can like line it up and do the ramp test with us, which is kind of fun and will help. I'm sure will help push you a little bit.
It's also a good way to make sure that that breathing part at the end isn't weird, because if you're doing it right along with us, it's not weird. So it's a good way to do that
too.
For sure. Changing gears a bit, we have Plan Builder. We've mentioned this before, but it's in the Mac and Windows app now, which is really cool, and it's on the website. And Plan Builder, for those that don't know, it's an amazing tool. I've been using it like crazy lately, changing things around, testing things, just looking at what different things would be like. It's fun to be able to build the season. But Nate, you're going to, or actually you use this heavily recently because you got into DK200, the rescheduled DK200 in September.
Yes. And I haven't used Plan Builder for that yet. So Dirty Kansas rescheduled for mid-September. I'm just going to assume it's going to happen. Let's not debate it. Let's just say it's going to happen. Same with nationals. So I'm doing short power build, Criterion. I use Plan Builder for that, Criterion specialty, to go into nationals, which is August 1st. And then after that, I take a week off and then or maybe a week and a half, and then probably I'll see what Plan Builder says, but probably Century specialty, because I'll have a pretty good base for the year, building into DK200 with maybe a couple, hopefully, John, if you want to go, we can ride together by then, some longer outside gravel rides to get used to the position. I haven't ridden Chamois Hagar for anything over maybe 3 hours. And it's just like, who knows what's going to happen to my neck and my back and all that sort of stuff. So I got in, did I say this, by a charity slot, which is really cool because now I get support there with mechanic at the two spots. So that's super awesome. I'm excited.
Yeah, it's exciting. That's got to be a huge help to have, right, Amber? Like to have, because your husband was doing it for you, right? Like running support throughout that race.
Yeah. With that race, honestly, success is as much about logistics as it is about fitness and grit. So, the pit crew is crucial, and I definitely wouldn't have been able to do it without my husband being there for me. So, yeah, that's going to be a huge value.
How far did you make it before you crashed, or before you had to go out?
So I crashed around 30 miles in, and I kept going for over 100 miles before I stopped. So, in retrospect, I think part of that was it was less about grit and toughness and more about making bad decisions while you're in shock. And the point at which I actually stopped had more to do with the fact that when I had crashed at the 30-mile point and kept going, I had really torn myself up on the right side of my body, which most cyclists are pretty familiar with road rash, and it's generally not that big of a deal. But I did actually take kind of a digger to the side of my knee, and that one started to like really balloon up, and it was looking very worrisome and feeling very worrisome to the point where it just wasn't worth causing any long-term issues. So that was the point that actually made me stop. But in retrospect, it probably would have been wise to stop before then.
So,
but
do you want to do it again this
140 miles? Not particularly, no.
Anybody want to do it?
No, I'm there to support you.
Not at all.
John, we didn't talk about our ramp test results because I'm sure
we didn't do that.
Know what we did in our Watt kg also. I've got Brandon's. Okay, so Brandon was there too. Brandon's our product manager. He's the fast guy we always talk about. His FTP was 321. His weight is about 139 pounds, and that puts him at 5.1 watts per kg at elevation, which is why we always say he's so fast and he just drops us. He's the guy who's dropped like Ted King and dropped Levi, right, on a climb. Levi Leipheimer.
Stetina.
Pretty fast.
Yeah.
No, Stetina beat him.
Yeah. It's pretty impressive athlete. And then we also had Pete with us, right?
Pete did Pete and I weighed in at the exact same weight in the morning, 193.8 exactly. And then he did a 342 result. Chad, you want to go next?
Yeah. So just before I got sick, I had elevated my threshold or my FTP to 305, and I expected to take a hit and probably return me to where I was before I got sick, which was 285, and I came out at 290. So I'm sort of okay with that. It's always a bit deflating to see your fitness go backwards, but it's okay. I'll get back on top of it soon enough.
Yeah, and that's just what happens when you get sick like this. You know, it's tough. Like when, and that's like something that you kind of have to almost like put an asterisk by it and be okay with it for a while, right, Chad? Where it's like you just know, like, hey, like this is me being impatient with it isn't going to fix it or anything like that. Just have to plug away.
No, it is what it is. I mean, they're all forms of motivation, demotivation, and this could be demotivating, but I won't let it be.
Awesome.
Amber?
Yeah, so I let's see, several weeks previous to that, I had done a RAM test and my FTP was at 237, and then that morning, the morning of the live RAM test, my weight was 151.4 pounds. So I had actually lost a little bit of weight, which I haven't been training that much, so I think it was a little bit more due to muscle loss than anything else. And then my result, I think I was 234, so I lost 3 watts on the day. So that honestly is, I just haven't been training consistently. And yeah, to your point, Chad, you know, it can be, I mean, it's certainly pretty far off from where I was when I was racing for sure. But I think the thing to keep in mind with the ramp test is it's just about seeing where you are, because the whole point of training, you need to meet yourself where you are on the day. And literally that goes for every day of training. But the point of the ramp test is to see where you are so that we're calibrating the correct intensity and giving you the right workouts day in and day out. So yeah, it's something that, you know, you can hang your hat on a good one, but also, you know, there's no reason to get down on yourself if you have a little bit of a backslide, because it's not about who you are as an athlete. It's just about, okay, where are you right now? And then making sure that you're calibrating your training appropriately. And if you calibrate your training appropriately, meet yourself where you are, you're going to make the best gains. So it's a data point. And it's actually, honestly, it's sort of motivating to me.
Yeah, I can see that.
John,
but it's not, I like how you stated that. It's not who you are as an athlete, it's where you are at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, John, we talk about, you know, you don't need to taper or do anything special coming into ramp tests, but also we should talk about this. You did maybe the opposite of what you should do, is you rebuilt a bunch of fences over the weekend and just trashed your legs and yourself before doing the ramp test, which is so what we want too is something like what is consistent for you. So if like you're at the office, you don't need to be like, I need to take a day off from the office, but don't like go lay pavers or do manual work or do a 100-mile ride the day before. John, though, you're selling your house, right? So you kind of had no choice, and we had this scheduled. So excuses
we just
aside,
have to
you still did look like you did well, but what was your result?
Yeah, so I was 314. So up from 306 was the last test that I did. So 314, and that puts me to 4.6 watts per kilogram right now. So and like you said, sure, like the circumstances probably weren't ideal, but that's the really cool thing about the ramp test. Like my legs felt like complete garbage. Like I could hardly like sit down, right? But I can still perform well on the ramp test. I guarantee you, if I had done the 2x8 or the 1x20, it would have been really hard for me. This is just personally to be able to like pace through that whole thing and carry that out. But the nice part about the ramp test is that it does a good job of weeding through a lot of variables and finding your fitness. And so I think that it's honestly, yesterday I did a really hard VO2 workout, DAID +1. And the workout felt like it was really darn close to where it should be. So maybe slightly underperforming, but probably only a matter of a few watts. We're not talking a huge amount at all. So pretty cool to see that even on days like that, it still, you know, does a good job of finding the accurate spot where you should be. So it's a ton of fun. It's cool. Nate, you.
Yeah.
And if too, for other people, if that happens to them, you could always kind of just tap it up a few watts if you think, but I wouldn't go more than 5. Like, that would be probably a lot. But if you're like, hey, I could, I don't know, maybe take out 2 or 3 watts, and it probably won't impact your training either way if you do that. I got 352, and you guys haven't done this. Well, Amber could, but you got to do elevation adjusted, guys, because we're at 4,500 feet. So adding like Right,
Typing
Chad?
now.
5%. Yeah, typing. Tell us what it is, plus your watt kg. So you can expect maybe like a 5% improvement at sea level when we race, and we've kind of seen that. And it could be different for different people. That makes me at sea level maybe like 370. And then for up in Reno, I'm 88 kilograms, so 193.8. And that is, or 94, 4 watts per kilo, but at sea level like 4.2. So happy with that. That's the highest ramp test, actually any test result I've ever had. Started in high power build, could do my workouts. They were incredibly hard, or at least, what is it, Friel? Yeah, Friel, where Chad, you're a maniac. It's like 125%, and then you go to like 88% for rest.
Mm-hmm.
Those two, you talk about upping your VO2 max, like getting ramped up and then staying there. I find those workouts to do that so well. Like my breathing, my heart rate is just pegged, but my legs, because you get those rest periods, my legs are never my limiter, which I really love. Mm-hmm. Where sometimes in like a 3-minute interval, my legs are dying before my lungs do. I really like that up and down. And then we'll see. Hopefully I'll get a huge bump in 4 weeks and we all do it live again.
Yeah, that's exactly what those are about. And that's why when we get to the last of today's podcast and we talk favorite workouts, we'll talk a little bit more about that specific format.
Yeah. So Nate, I adjusted for elevation, which for me, I think suggested is somewhere around 5%. I've found it closer to be 7% for me. So that puts me somewhere around 335 down at like elevation.
12% for me.
Yeah. So it's and then that puts me just under 5 watts per kilo at sea level. So getting close. It's exciting times. Ooh. Exciting times. Okay, so let's run into first of all the other thing too. Beers with Chad. It's a hit, a massive hit. Nate, you almost burned the whole thing down last week.
I'm retired from Beers with Chad, just so everyone knows. And if you saw it, you saw it. And if you didn't, we just like talked about, I don't know, bikes, and that's it.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. It's a good thing those things disappear after 24 hours, huh? So, but yeah, it's it's
scared,
a ton
John,
of fun.
In the middle.
Oh my gosh! Like
we were all scared.
Genuinely, at one point, I realized that my hands were clenched and my knuckles were white because I was like so nervous that you were just going to completely just torch the whole thing. Like, yeah.
I lost all sense of time. I really thought we had been on for the better part of an hour, and it was like 20 minutes.
I woke up at 2 a.m. and I was like, what did I say? Because I had a couple drinks on the show, and I was like, what did I do? And I almost went on Instagram and deleted it right away. But everyone like messaged me and was like, no, you were fine. It's like, okay.
Yeah.
I do know the only malarkey that happened is Chad said he could beat me in basketball, which like we need to do something, Chad, because that is never going to happen.
No.
That's all I was like brought up to do.
We're never going to do it.
Yeah.
From the age of like 6th grade, people are just like, you're playing basketball up through college. I didn't play college ball or anything like that, but I just city league and stuff like that.
All sorts of like basically anything, any sort of bet, promise, anything that's made during Beers of Chad is actually null. Like we just let it slide. It doesn't exist thereafter. Mm-hmm. So you have to.
What happens at Beers with Chad stays with Beers with Chad.
John, we said you were going to beat us in Ironman as soon as you can string them all 3 sports together well, and you kind of get the bugs out of your triathlon execution. That's true. My sober self says that's true.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's like. I think that minimizes the difficulty of figuring out all of those things, right? Because that's like, it's a complex thing to figure out how to execute well in triathlon. So
you learn how to swim, you eat a ton, and you don't go too hard on the bike. It's like that's the basics of it.
Yeah, no, but sure.
If you eat enough and you don't go too hard on the bike, that's what it is. And drink enough. It's hard to do. It sounds simple, but it's hard to do in the moment because you get caught up in the race. Learning how to swim is hard, and then eating enough is hard too because you're not super hungry because you're not even going that hard on the bike, but you don't realize you have a marathon where it's going to be really hard to take in any food later on. I mean, to the amount that you could on the bike. So that's the simple execution, but it takes time. And then if you eat too much, you're in trouble. Water, hydration, salt, cramps, endurance, position. Talk about what are they called? When you can't even think of it. On your feet when you get a sore, what is that thing called?
Blisters.
Blister?
Hot spots?
Blisters.
Yes.
Blisters can be bad.
Beers of Chad is still affecting Nate. So
Just right in there a little bit. Yeah. Okay. I'll shut up now.
okay. So you can join us though at 2 p.m. Pacific tomorrow. That'll be Friday, and that will be April 17th. Nate, sorry, very excited.
Can Amber be the host?
Yes.
She is
Yes.
the host.
Amber, you are the host
Yes.
this week. So
Do you know this, Amber?
I was told, yeah, and I'm a little scared. I mean, Nate has set the bar impossibly high. I think
Dangerous precedent.
So yeah.
To
Very
Nate,
dangerous
just
precedent.
legally, Amber, you cannot do what I did. Like, I don't expect
Yes.
it. You can have bubbly water. Please don't
Whatever
try to
you
do
want.
that.
What Nate set a bar that should never be touched. Never be touched. That's way up here.
Not even by Nate.
Yep. That's going to remain untouched. There's a whole lot of middle ground to explore in between, my sober bubbly water stuff and then Nate. So it's a blast though. Join us. It's a good time to connect with everybody, and we ask silly questions. Also, fun questions, whatever they are. But it's not like this. It's not like we're talking about how to make you a faster cyclist. It's a lot of fun stuff. So come join us. Yeah, quite the opposite. So it's the other side. It's the B sides of the podcast, if you will. So, and you can actually, all the questions that you'll be tossing in, we have an army of people sending them to Amber, so then Amber can keep track of them because there's entirely too many. They're flooding through constantly. So come bring some silly and fun questions, some vexing questions that'll make Chad and Amber pause and think for a while before they answer really fun ones too.
Don't hesitate to try to vex Amber also.
Yeah, because that could be tough to do. Yeah. So cool.
I'm hosting, Chad, so I'm in control of filtering what questions I get to ask.
Yeah, okay. I can still see them cropping up though, so every once in a while I'll grab one.
So that's on Instagram,
Fair.
and you
Fair's
can
fair.
find us at TrainerRoad on Instagram, and you can once again join us Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific. So, okay, follow up, Amber. Just jumping straight into the questions. When we were talking about stress-induced depression and plenty of other things, somebody actually wrote in and says, Amber keeps mentioning stress-induced depression. How does this change for brain injury-induced depression? And you did some research on this, right?
Yeah. So what this person's question is referring to is when we talked about myokines, and I won't go too far in the weeds with that. You can refer back to the previous episode, but myokines are essentially what a lot of recent research is revealing is that our skeletal muscles work like endocrine organs. So when you exercise and contract your muscles, they actually manufacture and secrete these amazing compounds that have tons of beneficial effects, not only to make you better at exercising, but also that have really cool beneficial and protective effects elsewhere in the body. And one of those in particular can have protective effects for the brain against stress-induced depression. So this person's question was, how does this change for brain injury-induced depression? Which is a really great question, because stress-induced depression, you're looking at more of a hormonal and chemical mechanism that's underlying the depression. Whereas with concussion, you're talking about a mechanical force that causes shearing forces in the brain that actually can injure some of the structure of the brain and alter membrane receptor structure at the site of injury. So it's a different input, but a similar result. So you end up with depression related to the injury, but from a different mechanism. So that's a really cool question. So quick review of the myokines. There are these beneficial compounds that our muscles manufacture and secrete. The one that I talked about in particular is called, wait for it, peroxisome proliferator activated receptor gamma coactivator 1 alpha. So instead of saying that 10 times fast, I'm going to call that PGC for short. But this one's really cool. So this is the one that I sort of did a deep dive into last time. There's a bunch of different types of myokines, and they're discovering new ones all the time. So if you're interested in this, it's a really rich area of research right now that's super interesting. So to look at this, again, when you have concussion, you have a mechanical force that's causing these shearing forces. And one of the major issues that come up with that is the shearing force can cause damage to the cell membranes, and that can happen at the neuron level. And when you have that damage to the membrane, it creates kind of a cascade of effects. So one of those things is it allows more ions to move across the membrane than would normally be regulated. So you have ion dysregulation. And then when you have ions being distributed abnormally, it can make it more difficult for the mitochondria to maintain this chemical gradient, so a gradient of protons across the membrane in the mitochondria. You've probably heard Chad talk about this before, but that proton gradient in the mitochondria is what's necessary for the mitochondria to produce ATP, which is the energy currency of all of the cells in our body. So you get this ion dysregulation, and then you can have energy dysregulation, and then of course you have the structural dysregulation when you have damage to the cells. It's not just the membrane, but also things like the cytoskeleton and the microtubules can become damaged. Those then need to be metabolized and recycled. And then you can also get some vascular dysregulation. So all of these things can disrupt blood flow, is in addition to having structural damage to the vascularization in the brain. So there's all of these things that can happen as a result of concussion. And I found an interesting review paper from 2019 that looked at this. And the title of the so this is by Neary et al. The title of the paper is "Why Exercise May Be Beneficial in Concussion Rehabilitation: A Cellular Perspective." So they're looking at the cellular level of this. And keep in mind that it's really difficult to do human studies where you're looking at what's going on at the cellular level. It's just not really possible to do that real time. So most of the time when they're looking at this, it's either a mouse model or they're looking at proxies for what's happening at the cellular level. So take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. But what this review paper did was they looked at a lot of the recent research on this, and they came up with 3 primary conclusions. The first is that exercise can be beneficial for recovering from sport concussion, as exercise can amplify cellular healing. And myokines, not surprisingly, are involved in those healing processes. The second conclusion was exercise can be harmful for recovering from sport concussion if the exercise is too intense. So there's a dose dependency here. And the third thing is, which is kind of a logical conclusion from the first two, that understanding the physiology of concussion recovery and why exercise can be both good and bad may lead to improvements in recovery protocols. So understanding this dose dependency and where you can find the sweet spot of enough exercise to induce the benefits without doing so much that you're actually causing damage, that's where we want to get with this. And of course, I want to talk a little bit about how they, because PGC in particular was one of the myokines that they mentioned in this paper. They talked about other ones too. I won't go into everything, but it's interesting to see how this affects concussion as an example. So the usual caveats apply: age, gender, fitness. They even mentioned that time since your last exercise bout can have effects. Medications, all of these things will affect how you should be managing your concussion. And then they also affect how your body responds to exercise. So how your body responds to exercise obviously would influence whether exercise would be beneficial to the healing process after concussion. So all of these things are confounding factors that need to be taken into account. Because of that, health practitioners generally make very conservative decisions about managing your concussion, because if you have 2 patients presenting the same symptoms, you might be able to tolerate, a great deal more physical activity or cognitive load than the other one. It's really hard to tell, especially with concussions. So practitioners are generally going to err on the side of being conservative. And one of the things they mentioned, they cited another study, which I didn't get into, but it's worth noting, that there are issues when you suddenly limit the activity level of somebody who's used to being really active, especially, for example, elite athletes, and that sudden limitation can be more detrimental than previously thought. So that's another kind of interesting topic for additional reading that I'm not going to get into right now, but that's one of the factors that can kind of cloud clinical understanding of what's going on in the healing process. So getting back to PGC, we know that when you exercise, it increases PGC. So your muscles manufacture and secrete PGC, which facilitates mitochondrial biogenesis. So it's one of the good things we talked about. It makes your muscles more able to exercise and be aerobically efficient. But it doesn't just do this in the muscles. So it can increase metabolic pathways that increase mitochondrial density and efficiency that actually help to enhance cerebral blood flow, which is one of the things we need for healing from concussion. The other thing that PGC does is via a secondary pathway, which I'm not going to walk through right now because we don't have all the time in the world right now, but it can actually help to increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And brain-derived neurotrophic factor does a few things that are really important to concussion healing. One is it protects neurons against injury and disease, and it enhances repair of damaged DNA and neurons. Not surprisingly, brain-derived neurotrophic factor needs mitochondrial biogenesis in order to do its job another one of its jobs, which is to stimulate the formation of new synapses and to maintain currently healthy synapses. So the PGC not only helps to increase the brain-derived neurotrophic factor so that it can protect and repair synapses in the brain, but PGC is also helping stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis, which helps the brain-derived neurotrophic factor do its job. So it's pretty interesting kind of feedback loop there. Pretty amazing. Again, the body is remarkable.
Yeah.
But I want to just touch back on one of these caveats. So intensity and duration of the exercise are really important in this. So we know that exercise can increase levels of PGC, which, as we've just seen, has certain benefits. But some of the research is showing that if you go above your ventilation threshold, which is different than your FTP, ventilation threshold is sort of that point at which your ventilation increases pretty dramatically as you're exercising. And at that point, what can happen just naturally under normal circumstances, not even with concussion, is you get a little bit of cerebral vasoconstriction, which is the blood vessels in the brain constrict and reduce blood flow a little bit. Under normal circumstances, that's not problematic. But when you're healing from concussion, that can be, and it can exacerbate some of the symptoms and maybe be detrimental. The other thing that can happen is some research is showing that longer durations, even over 45 minutes, might also be detrimental. And they're not really sure why this is yet, but they're thinking that it's probably due to oxidative stress, increased cortisol, and again, going back to that impaired cerebral blood flow. So you don't want to exercise too hard or too long. So, there's going to be a sweet spot. It's probably different for everybody. But the point is that for concussion or brain injury, you want to try to regulate the neuronal environment immediately following the injury. And we know that based on some of the research, some mild, and this is one of the things they say in the paper, some mild sympathetic shift that we associate with exercise can elicit really beneficial cascades at the cellular level. And as long as you don't overdo it, you can get all of those benefits without the oxidative and mitochondrial stress that can put you at more risk. So there you go.
I feel like I'm sure all of us here have suffered a concussion at some point in our bike racing or otherwise. And I think that the one thing I would want to share with all of that was fantastic, by the way, and to echo you, Amber, the body's amazing, right? How it can do all that. But
so cool.
It's normal to feel some sort, or at least for me, it's normal to feel after a concussion, definitely like a perceptible level of depression. And I actually had a pretty severe concussion when I was younger racing motocross, and that lasted for a very extended period of time. I mean, like over a year. And I think that that's important because a lot of us athletes probably are in a situation where, so number one, depression isn't spoken about a whole lot. We view it as something, a lot of the time we view it as like a weakness, our society does, and like a mental weakness. And I think it's really important to discuss, especially right now, because a lot of people are in, their lives are out of balance, right? And they're going through this whole sort of thing. So it's an important thing to recognize that it can happen. And once again, it's coming down to simply like, an imbalance in your brain, which is a very complex thing. But also it doesn't, just because you haven't had something seemingly drastic happen in your life, and maybe you crashed and you hit your head and you think, no, I'm fine. Like it was just like the helmet's fine. Like there's nothing like that. But if you feel something like this, it's important to recognize and just respect it, and to respect yourself, I think, through that process. I do feel that it's been really important for me to stand back and externalize it and to recognize that. So those are just my 2 cents adding onto that. So that was awesome, Amber. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I want to echo that. Oh, please go ahead, Nate.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. It's the delay. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, sorry, guys. This is probably going to happen a few times today. I similarly, after the crash at DK, I didn't realize that I was concussed at first because I made that rookie mistake of assuming, oh, I didn't hit my head, so I'm fine. But I had hit the ground so hard that, your brain is floating around in fluid in your skull, and your skull is a hard object. And so my brain, smacked into the inside side of my skull, and there you go. But to your point, it was it was really hard. And I experienced definitely some very significant depressive symptoms, and also a lot more anxiety than normal, which is saying a lot for me. But it's very real. It's very real. And it's not just it doesn't just happen with brain injury either. I mean, it's certainly something that's pervasive among athletes, and it's something that, you know, it's a tough thing to manage, but it is manageable. So it's not something that, you know, necessarily is ever going to prevent you from reaching your goals as an athlete. Absolutely, but it is a tough one, and it's fairly common. So don't feel like you're alone if that's something that you're experiencing, especially now.
I was forgetful, so in the middle of my sentence, I would just stop and forget what I was going to say. And the other thing is, I'd get angry like super fast. Something would happen, and I'd go from like 0 to anger. And then I knew though I wouldn't externalize it and just blow up. Hopefully, you guys didn't see me in the office just throw something. But I knew that like I'm like, whoa, concussion is doing this, not somebody who left something out or something like that. You know, something silly that would get you way more mad than you normally would. Amber, I'm going to paraphrase what you said, and correct me if I'm wrong. If you get a concussion,
okay, let's do it.
Light exercise might help, but don't do too much, like over 45 minutes.
Yeah, but you're going to want to talk to your doctor for sure, because again, you know,
yes.
Because there are all those confounding factors, right? Like it depends a lot on what your exercise history was. It depends a lot on the nature of your injury. I mean, there's a whole lot of things that can affect this. So, you know, that is a very succinct way of putting what the research is showing right now. But again, like they have a long way to go on this.
The other thing that my doctor said, which is crazy, is that when you do have a concussion, like you got to make sure you do not ride your bike outside until your concussion is completely gone, because your risk of death is like 50%, not 50% higher, but 50% if you get another concussion. I checked with her, I was like, that makes really 50%. But yeah, so if you get a concussion and then you crash again and get another concussion, which I think is way more likely if you have a concussion, your death rate might be 50%, which is so scary to me. So anyways, people should know that. Talk to your doctor to make sure, you know, like as Amber said, but in general, play on the safe side if you have a concussion. It takes a while.
It does. And what's really encouraging, so when I got my concussion, I was really lucky. I got to work with a concussion specialist. He is the doctor who helps all of the athletes on the PBR circuit, as an example, and he works with the Yankees. And so he's worked with a lot of high-level athletes who've dealt with this. So he really knew what he was talking about. And one of the things that he said was there's so many advances happening on this front right now that we really understand better now than ever all these different types of concussions, all the systems that can be affected. And it does seem like the research is moving more in the direction of gently stressing the systems that have been affected to accelerate healing, which is one of the things that we see kind of this paper is one of those examples, I think. So that seems to be the direction things are going. But again, it really depends on your individual's situation.
I think I've got an idea for us on this podcast. We're going to be like kids in school and we're going to raise our hands, and then it's going to probably help with the delay. What do y'all say?
Ooh, I like it.
Awesome. Sounds good. Okay, let's get into Brian's question. He says, "Hey guys, I've been listening to the podcast for a while now and I love it. And it's one of the main reasons I opted for TrainerRoad for some structured support for training for the first time. My question is, I have up to 8 hours per week and I'm wanting to stick to the workouts Plan Builder has suggested for me in my calendar. However, at the moment, I'm juggling work and homeschooling a couple kids. So some weeks I may have to split my workouts into shorter sessions across more days. Do you have any suggestions on how to do this and still get the greatest benefit? Cheers from Brian." Chad, take it away.
Like I said, Brian, this really isn't the worst situation to be in. I mean, in some cases, it might not be the most productive tack, but in others, you might be surprised at how much it can do in terms of boosting performance. So we've talked at length many times over when it comes to doing a high intensity workout and combining it with later in the day a low intensity, or perhaps preceding that high intensity workout with the low intensity. So you can comb previous podcasts. I think we just covered that like 2 podcasts ago. But when it comes to splitting a single high intensity workout, or even just an intense session, and I qualify basically Sweetspot and above as something that I deem intense, it changes things a bit. So let's cover high intensity first, meaning basically VO2 max, anaerobic, maybe if you're doing sprint training, that sort of thing. There's a hormonal elevation that happens at the end of, or during and at the end of, any high intensity workout. And if you're going to split your workout into 2 parts, you're going to have to overcome that twice. So largely that shifts the importance to nutrition, or shifts greater importance onto your nutrition. So you're going to want to calm that hormonal cascade and bring yourself back to normal as quickly as possible, so as not to compromise the quality of the second workout, which is probably the big concern. First workout is probably going to be plenty productive. How high in quality can you keep that second workout? A lot of this carries over to the muscle endurance workouts, which are basically sweet spot and threshold, over unders, that sort of thing. Same rules apply. You're going to elevate those hormones. You're going to have to calm them again. But I think these are even more taxing because they're more glycogen depleting. So the energy that you will need if you're going to break this workout into 2 parts is even more important. I think it's a lot easier to take a VO2 max workout, chop it in half, and get through that second half, even if you don't replenish. You probably still have enough fuel on board. That is not the case for something like Sweetspot, especially if you're doing, or over unders, especially if you're doing long intervals. So then you're really focused on keeping the quality of that second workout high, but also brace yourself for the fact that the RPE, the rating of perceived exertion, how you feel, it's going to suck on that second workout. You're not going to feel as fresh. You're not going to feel as ready to get after it. So just know this is going to feel a little tougher, but it's still in line with what I'm supposed to be facing. This is still going to bring me the benefits I'm seeking. This, I think probably it's a little more flexible for new riders because they're not going to experience the same level of detriment that a more experienced rider who needs more specific and heavy loads will face. So I think you say you're new to this, you can probably get away with this and see quite a lot of benefit, whereas a more advanced rider is probably going to have to make sure that the structure of the workout is more strictly adhered to. And then a lot of these workouts have very strict outcomes, or they're structured specifically so that you achieve a particular type of stress. And that stress is probably necessary considering the progression that's led you to that point. You need that next step up the ladder. So if you start to cut these workouts into parts, you might miss out on some of that. For instance, if you're going from 5 VO2 max intervals to 6 to 7, the fatigue that you're going to experience by that 6th and 7th kind of need to be in place for that 7th to be as productive as the workout intends. And then it's really easy to get caught up in the idea that we're just looking for time at intensity, so that if I get 7 3-minute intervals, I've got my 21 minutes. But that carries differently across a workout than it does across a day. So because of that, I think if you're going to split workouts, you kind of need to tack on a little more work. And I have a number of suggestions to do that. So you can always pick a minus version because they're typically a 45-minute or even a 30-minute version of that workout. Get through, something that's similar to what was scheduled, and then tack on an endurance ride later in the day. It's not exactly the same adaptations, but we're still seeking aerobic improvement, and endurance is going to convey some of that. So it might not be apples for apples, but it's still going to be a good way to go about it. An example of that is if you have 5 sweet spot intervals scheduled, maybe you do a workout where there's only 4, but then you do a 30-minute endurance ride afterward. That's probably going to bring you to roughly the same level of stress and, given proper recovery, the same level of adaptation, the same training response. You can also split a 60-minute workout into a couple 30-minute workouts over the course of the same day. And an example of this would be if you have 8 VO2 max intervals, maybe you do 2 times 5 of the same intervals split over 2 parts of the day. So effectively you get 10 intervals. So yeah, you did have a bit of downtime, a bit of extra recovery, but you're actually doing a higher workload than you would have done if you put it all into a single workout. You could also split a 60-minute workout across a couple of days. In that case, I would really up the workload. And I say really, but we're only talking an extra half hour in total by doing 2 45-minute workouts over those 2 days. An example here is maybe you have 4 over-under intervals scheduled in a 60-minute session, but instead you do 60 over-unders over the course of 2 45-minute workouts. So 2 by 3 of those similar intervals, and elevate the workload and elevate the stress, and hopefully compensate for that downtime in between the workouts. It's worth noting, I think, that high-level athletes basically do this sort of thing. It's also worth noting that they're working out 2 and 3 times a day, but they change the modality of the workout each time so that they're either complementary or they don't step on each other's toes. And this is really common practice amongst, and I'm talking very high level, like Olympic level athletes will work out 3 times a day, but they'll do something like high intensity in the morning, maybe a flexibility session, and then an aerobic session later in the evening, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of an
Yeah, and
interesting
I think
approach too. Oh, sorry, I didn't raise my hand. I broke my own rule. That was terrible.
I didn't either.
We'll be better, Amber. We'll be better. So
get
this
this.
is a particularly applicable question for a lot of people right now, I bet. It's like it's so hard to be a parent and to be training and to be carrying out everything that you need to for work, and it really is complex. When our son was born, I tried splitting things up into 2 different workouts, and it kind of worked, but it was really hard just to be able to, like, the simple thing. It was getting the kit ready and getting into kit and doing all of that again and getting my bottles ready and going out and going through that whole process again. It really does add up to it. So, like, it's just like an additional, I guess, a note of suggestion. I would say that if you are going to split this up, try to plan ahead for that, just because it gets complex. Nate, I see you're raising your hand. You may have experience with something like this.
Yeah, well, one thing that's helped me, because I have that exact same experience where I try to get on the bike by, like, say 3:30, but I actually get on at like 4:45, and because things get in the way. But what I've found too is with group workouts, if I schedule it and other people are waiting for me, I magically get there on time. And two, a really good culture thing for your group workouts is to make sure you start it on time. Like, just like group rides that leave, if you have it scheduled for 4 p.m. or 7 a.m., you start that thing at 7 a.m. and you don't wait for everyone to be perfectly ready. If they're not ready, they can, like, you don't drop them. They just come in a little bit later. Right, everybody? That's how it should be. That's actually, we do meetings at TrainerRoad too. I wait until at the, like, unless everyone's there, if it starts at 8 a.m., as soon as the clock turns 8 a.m., we start and we don't wait for anyone, because then it just pushes everybody out.
Mm-hmm. Everyone's waiting.
Yeah,
we don't know. Nobody was raising their hand.
Who's going to talk now? I should have raised my hand. No, we talked a little bit about other strategies too. So, like, expanding your definition of training during this time, especially if you're more time constrained than usual, or just your schedule is out of whack right now, as is the case for many of us. It is genuinely, I mean, consistency is key. We always want to be consistent, but it is okay to not perfectly follow your plan. Like, you do need balance in life. You are a human being. You are not a robot. In my notes here, I said it's not realistic to be 100% monk 100% of the time. Even monks don't do that. Funny side story. I actually took a class in college from a Zen Buddhist monk, and he was telling us the story of when he first, went to a monastery and was living the monk life. They actually purposefully would get wildly drunk from time to time, just so that they wouldn't become too attached to the concept of purity, which I thought was hilarious. But I mean, even monks, they're not going to be, they're not going to, it's not 100% of the time. Like, it's just, you gotta give yourself a little bit of room, a little bit of buffer there, because it's just, we're human, we're not perfect. And if you give yourself a little bit of buffer to being perfect once in a while, chances are you will end up being more consistent over the long run.
And chances are, through this whole process of trying to figure out how to train multiple times and doing all that, you will be imperfect, right? Like, it won't be executed perfectly every time. So you can still do both of these things. You can strive for more. You can strive to hit your marks in training, as we all should, all the time, just as we do in all aspects of our life. But we just have to be patient with ourselves, because it's not going to be perfect every time. And Chad, thank you for giving, like, those 3 different suggestions like that, kind of like laid out for folks, or the multiple suggestions that you provided, because that's helpful for sure. One thing that I would say is just my personal favorite out of all of those that I see up there. I really like the concept of picking a minus version, and then being able to basically hit your marks. And you can also use the workout creator if you want to alter these workouts as well, and you can adjust them that way. So we don't talk a whole lot about workout creator a lot of the time, but it's definitely a feature that would be useful in this sort of context. You'd have that, and you'd be able to make those adjustments. So Keegan's question. He says, I'm a junior mountain bike racer. I'm on a fairly high volume training plan, about 20 hours per week. Holy cow, that's a really high volume training plan. Not fairly,
That's
to me
fairly?
at least. Yeah,
That's a lot.
really high. Yeah. And says, I have an FTP of 5.4 watts per kilogram. This is why I hate racing against juniors. They're so fast, and they have such high watts per kg, right?
It's ridiculous.
So Keegan says, I can't seem to keep my nutrition in check, and we'll go weeks eating well, and then somehow slip back and gain 5 pounds. Are there any simple rules or guidelines I should be following to keep consistent weight loss? I want to keep progressing in the sport and become a more dedicated climber, but I'm not sure how to keep my impulses in check. So this one, when we first read this one, we definitely felt like this was an important question to address, and we'll cover a lot of different angles on this one. Chad, do you want to start off with this one?
Yeah, happily. I'm kind of happy. I like that this dovetails off of what Amber just said, in that, he talks about keeping his impulses in check. Well, sometimes you don't have to. In fact, it's probably beneficial if you don't. So it's a good way to segue into this one. First and foremost, Keegan, my brother, you need to relax. You're very fast and you're young. You got a lot of experience ahead of you. I first kind of want to talk about the consistent weight loss quote that you said, because that implies that you're perpetually dieting. Sorry. When your aim is really shifts in dietary lifestyle, you're looking for something that's permanent and sustainable, not temporary. So if you're always chasing this temporary thing, it's just a difficult thing to accomplish and maintain. And I'll get into a little bit of why that is. So temporary weight loss is just that. Whereas the daily habits that you establish and that you can live by yield the sustained body composition you're looking for. And when it comes to weight loss to achieve your racing or competition weight, this is a temporary state. I listened to a podcast the other day, and a very experienced coach named Dominic Manelli stated that where competition starts is where health ends. And I know there's shades of that too. It's not in all cases. You can find a balance, but if you think of the wrestler who's trying to cut a ton of water weight in a short period of time, not healthy. A physique athlete who's trying to get down to a extremely low level of body fat, not healthy. Grand Tour riders who put themselves through these tremendous challenges day after day after day, not healthy. But they also don't live there. They're there for brief periods of time. So you can seek racing weight, but recognize that it is just that. It's going to be a temporary state. And then when it comes to these fluctuations that happen, do know that they're frequent and transient. They're going to happen all the time. Body composition changes, however, are not. So if you're just getting on the scale and looking at your weight, man, that could change across a single day. But if you're looking at body composition changes, these are more due to changes in actual muscle composition, or the amount of muscle on your body, fat composition, and these things are synthesized and they break down over a much slower time course. So body composition is definitely more what you're talking about here. And there are various ways to monitor that. Some of them a little more reliable than others, but don't get too hung up on the weight, the actual weight readings, so much as what's actually happening to your body. And honestly, a lot of that can be done simply by looking at yourself in the mirror. You can tell if you put on a couple pounds of fat or even a pound of fat when you're as lean as I'm guessing you are, considering how much you're riding and how fast you are. So that brings me to, what causes these drastic and rapid shifts in body weight. And this is total body water. I mean, that's most of it. Your body weight fluctuations are largely due to body water. And when it comes to endurance athletes, yes, we do sweat a lot, and that dehydration alone can explain a fair amount of that weight change, but glycogen too. And we've talked many times about how glycogen isn't just sugar in the muscle, it's also water. And there's a lot of water. So for every gram of glycogen that you pack away, either in your liver or in your muscles, there's 3 to 4 grams of water that go along with it. So if you do the math, and let's just call those 3 to 4 grams 3.5 grams for the sake of the math. Most people have about 100 grams of glycogen in their liver when it's fully stocked up. And then athletes, man, you can go anywhere from 400 to 800 to whatever. We actually cultivate an ability to pack away more glycogen. But let's say in the case of you're 100 grams in the liver, 600 grams in your muscle, that's 700 grams. That alone weighs 1.5 pounds. The water that accompanies it is about 3.5 times that much, right? So more than 5 pounds right there. So if you were to do an exhausting workout that tapped those stores and really drained you in terms of glycogen and the water that goes with it, that's a heck of a lot of weight loss just from a single workout. So when you put that back on, I mean, maybe you hop on the scale afterwards, you want to see what happened to your water weight, and you see this low weight, and then you wake up the next day having replenished those glycogen stores, having eaten a couple meals, and your weight's skyrocketed seemingly. It's just glycogen back in the muscle and all the water that goes with it. So don't sweat it. I talked a while back how I would do depletion rides in the evening, and I used races in some cases to do them. And then I would go home and have either a low or a no carbohydrate meal and wake up in the morning and I'd be a pound lighter every day. I recognize that wasn't true fat loss. That wasn't probably changes in muscle composition. That was just water weight, but it felt good. And I found it motivating. It actually bit me in the butt after time, because I think some muscle did go along with it. So it was actually a pretty unhealthy habit, which is another thing I want to caution you against. These changes in weight loss can be poorly orchestrated, such that they lead to unsuccessful or undesirable outcomes. Nate?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this can happen too with people who start keto, is they lose a lot of glycogen in their muscles and they get a very significant weight loss, or people who are chronically low carb and then they eat some carbohydrates to train and they're like, I gained all this weight, when they may not be in a big calorie surplus or at all, but their muscles take on more glycogen. Someone on the forum just said they gained 9 pounds in 2 weeks by adding 50 grams of carbs to their bottle per hour on the bike. Like they went from 0 to 50, which is mathematically like not possible. But if you, I'm assuming this person was low carb before, and then you start packing away more water and more glycogen, which will probably make you in most all races faster. Maybe a 20% climb that's short or something not. But other than that, I think day in, day out, your training will be better if you have some glycogen in your muscles, or in races especially. If you have any long races, it really, really helps.
Mm-hmm. Chad, do you want to carry on?
Absolutely. My first bit of advice before I actually get to my heartier advice is that trust weekly averages more than daily measurements. So if you're going to measure yourself every day on the scale, even if it's body composition, take it with a grain of salt. Body composition doesn't change on that time course. So you're going to see changes over the course of a week. So if at the end of the week you compare your weekly averages, I think that's going to be more useful information, and it's definitely less stressful and potentially less misleading. And then this is also just a note to tack on, the food in your intestines can also sway your body weight measurements. I mean, sometimes you don't clear all of it out, and it may not seem like there can be a lot in there, but there can actually be quite a lot in there. I mean, literal pounds, multiple pounds. Okay, so this brings me to, excuse me, my 3 pieces of advice for you. First and foremost, is to work with a sports nutritionist, preferably a registered dietitian who's trained in sports nutrition. So, someone who takes this as a career, has done the schooling, is constantly brushing up on skills and staying abreast of current research, et cetera. And the questions that you and this nutritionist will ask is, at what body composition can I, 1, support my training, 2, keep my risk of illness and injury low, 3, optimize both sleep and recovery, to go hand in hand, 4, manage my stress, both in general and around your diet. Try to find a way that you're not constantly obsessing over or micromanaging your diet. And there's a chance that you can fly solo on this. Maybe you have a good support system. Maybe you do your reading. Maybe you have a good handle on nutrition as it stands right now. But just one example of why I would like younger riders, and really any rider who can afford it, who has access, to work with a dietitian, is supplementation, for instance. I mean, we're as endurance athletes, we're big proponents of supplementation, it seems. And the thing with supplementation is it requires proper measurement of your biomarkers, in particular blood work. Otherwise, it's a guessing game. You don't know if you're truly deficient in something, if you truly need to enhance it, if you are enhancing it, if you're overshooting it, undershooting it, et cetera, without doing blood work. And even then, blood work is just snapshots, and you have to look at trends. And working with a nutritionist is just going to be a better bet, because you guys can mark and note those trends, discuss those trends. You're keeping a better view on your diet as a whole. So it's also an opportunity to discern food allergies and intolerances, things that you might not otherwise pick up on that a nutritionist would. And it's worth noting that people are really crappy at self-assessment, especially when it comes to estimating calorie intake. We've talked before, and it's bandied about quite a bit, that New England Journal of Medicine study way back, where people were struggling with weight loss. They had them estimate their caloric intake, and they were off by as much as 50%. Which is drastic. I mean, we're talking, you think you took in 2,000 calories and you actually took in 3,000, or you think you took in 1,500 and you actually took in, over 2,200 of them. It's tough to be objective. It can be. Okay, second bit of advice, nutrition periodization. And I think you probably have a handle on this. To operate at the level at which you operate, you've got to. So you understand that you have to fuel your workouts, but don't shy away from eating during the recovery periods. I see a lot of athletes that just, they reach this level of body composition. They want to stay at it. They approach a recovery week and they undernourish over the course of that recovery week. It's not a big deal if you put a pound back on over the course of a week. You'll take it off. You definitely have the motor to do it. And if your hunger is substantiated, you're not eating for comfort, you're not eating out of boredom, just make healthful choices and try not to overeat. And when it comes to overeating, high-level athletes are seriously the best in the business at recognizing their hunger and satiety signals. They have healthy metabolisms. They have high hormone sensitivity. They're really good at paying attention to when enough is truly enough, when excess becomes excess. And then finally, focus more on certain things. One of them being watts over watts per kilogram. Body composition shifts are a heck of a lot easier than elevating fitness. And honestly, they also facilitate the sort of body composition you want. You put yourself in a position, Nate's a good example of this, where he can do a ton of work, he can maintain his body composition and eat whatever the heck he wants. And on the topic of Nate and myself to some extent, even big guys can climb. You just need to have big watts. So again, watts over watts per kilogram. Don't fear a little bit of weight if it comes in the form of muscle, when maybe an extra pound could yield 15 extra watts, or maybe 15 more minutes at your climbing power output. And then to wrap this up, continue to develop that aerobic engine. Eddie Merckx said, ride lots. And there's so much to take from that. Such a pithy statement, but it's true. This is the time in your life where any infrastructure you lay down is going to serve you for years as an athlete and as a healthy person in general. And straightforward volume is an excellent way to do this. Just ride a ton.
One thing to add, so I guess kind of like an additional perspective to this. So this is like very good general guidance on how to have your priorities straight when we're talking about training and body composition and how to reach that and how to do so responsibly. And in this case, since we're talking to Keegan and Keegan is a junior athlete, there are definitely some more concerns. And I really like how you ended off there, Chad, on focusing on watts rather than watts per kilogram and focusing on developing that aerobic engine. Because the thing that you have to remember, Keegan, is a young athlete, you should weigh more every year. Like you should be gaining weight. You're growing, right? So that is not a bad thing. That's a positive thing. And that's just what your body needs. And as you make sure that you're, like Chad put those great priorities in check of making sure you're fueling your work, making sure that you can adequately recover and supporting like the right things, as long as you're doing that, it's okay. Let your weight be what your weight would be. Because I think that the key in this is, as a junior athlete in particular, this is something you really want to nail right now in terms of getting that straight, right, Amber? Like if it could put them in a lot better position.
Yeah, this is a great time. I mean, first of all, if you're listening to this and not watching, I've just been sitting here like nodding enthusiastically with everything that Chad said. So like ditto to everything that Chad said. Focus on those watts, build that engine. And especially as a junior, I mean, no matter how long you want to be in the sport, as a junior, you're really laying the foundation for sustainable success in the sport. And success being however you want to define that for you, whatever your goals and aspirations may be, now is the time to lay a great foundation for that. And a foundation is, it's like the base of a pyramid. It's broad and it should be substantial. So it's not just about focusing on one metric like watts per kg. I mean, focus on those watts, build that engine, but remember that there are a variety of facets to being an athlete that are a part of that foundation. So, in particular, physical and mental health are really important. And I think you look at athletes who have the most successful careers, one of the tricks, quote unquote, to having a successful career is not to become ill or injured at an inconvenient time. And your nutrition is a huge component of that. So getting a handle on some really good, healthy habits now will serve you not only on the bike, but in life. And to that point, on the mental side of building out a foundation as an athlete, I think it's important to remember that the foundation of discipline is really enthusiasm. It's more enthusiasm than it is willpower, because it's not just about like forcing yourself to go out on the bike when you don't want to, or forcing yourself to do something you don't want to. It's about remembering why you do want to, connecting with the reason that you do want to, cultivating a sense of enthusiasm, and then getting out on the bike. And that's, that's not like a strength or weakness thing. That's a skill, and it's, cultivating enthusiasm sustainably over time. It takes effort. You have to really nurture that enthusiasm. So remembering that keeping a sense of fun and enjoyment about what you're doing is really important, and that will support your discipline, your consistency, and your success over time. And then a corollary to that is to ground yourself in curiosity and not preconceptions. So, going back to what we were talking about earlier, no one can be 100% monk 100% of the time. Like, no one's a robot. You look at professional level athletes, and yeah, kind of from the outside looking in, it might be easy to think that they're just nailing it every day and they don't skip workouts and they don't have a hard time and they don't struggle and their willpower is 100%. Not true. Everybody who's an athlete is a human being, and we all have our fallibilities, and everybody makes mistakes, struggles, has setbacks, gets, so just remember, try to remember that, disconnect from those preconceptions, ground yourself in a sense of curiosity about your own path. What is going to work for you as an athlete, and what works for you may not work for somebody else. It may not be the same path. It may not be the thing that works for another athlete that you're looking at. And on the physical side, again, going back to that foundational, explore and develop multiple facets of the sport and of who you are as an athlete. So become a great competitor. Hone your skills on the bike. Skills can be, especially on mountain bike, it could be as important as your FTP or watts per kg to being fast. Build out your experience, develop good race intuition, study the sport, become a student of the sport, build your knowledge. And in addition to becoming a great competitor, learn how to become a great teammate. Great teammates are as much about contributing to team cohesion as they are about being really fit and getting results. The best teammates don't just get good results, but the best teammates are those people whose presence on the team elevates and assures everybody else on the team. So learn how to be one of those teammates that's the glue of your team. These are all ways that you can develop yourself as an athlete. So I just want to echo everything that Chad said and then zoom out to the bigger picture and just remember, you got a lot of time ahead of you. So don't worry so much.
Something I want to add, just directly kind of addressing a certain few things. Keegan, as far as can't keep my nutrition in check, I'd challenge you to have like a perspective shift and to think instead just of fueling the work, like Chad said, right? And look at it in that regard. And then talking about slipping back and gaining 5 pounds, don't think of it in that regard. It's okay. Let your weight be your weight. Instead, just focus on enjoying the process of riding your bike and training. Finally, as Amber said, with curiosity, everybody wants to be a fast climber, right? Like, especially when we first start or when we're young, especially you, Keegan, because you're riding up against a bunch of juniors that are somehow like 9 watts per kilogram. Like it's insane. I don't know how it works. So because that everybody wants to be a faster climber, but don't, like Amber said, don't shoehorn yourself. Like give yourself the opportunity to explore and become whoever you may want to become. And that can change from day to day. It can change at any point throughout all of your career for racing. Nate, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So Keegan, you are in puberty. If you're a junior rider, do not worry at all about your weight. Your brain is developing well into the 20s. Like, hopefully if I ever coach juniors, it's ridiculous. Don't worry about your weight right now. Like, you're growing. I like Chad's idea, dietitian. Like, man, you should have if I coached a junior team, I would have a dietitian come and talk to the whole team, right? And talk about these sort of subjects. You can do because John's point too, you're going to gain weight every year just naturally. I like that idea of you could use, if you're really competitive, and this is very important to you, I do not stress this for everyone, but maybe the very, very pointy end of it, use some fat calipers, get a basic, like, okay, my goal is not to get above 15% body fat, which you're probably not going to hit anyways as a 16-year-old doing 20 hours a week. And then inside of there, try to eat the healthy foods, but then know, like, you have to be, to all your guys' points, you have to it's okay to eat a hamburger and like some French fries, not if you're Chad, but like once in a while, because like you're a kid and you'll feel better.
But Chad drinks beer.
Yeah. Don't drink beer, Keegan.
Depends on pick your poison.
Pick your poison. That's the point. Yeah.
I mean, like, just like you will not have long-term sustained performance if you try to live like a monk, to Amber's point right now. And it's the amount of stress you're putting on your body. Don't worry about that. The other thing to say is that, to Jonathan said, all juniors have these crazy watt per kilos. And it's only because they're extremely light, not because they have a high FTP, because they're still developing. So to be a faster rider overall is going to have a higher FTP. So when you get to be in your 20s, and if you still want to race during that time, it's going to be, your body's going to be where it is, and then you're going to need a whole bunch of watts. And the people who undernourish the whole time as a junior, like, they're going to fall off when they're 18, 19, 20, 21, and they still want to race, because they don't have a high watts, but they're going to be done growing and they're going to be bigger. So don't worry about that, and maybe get a couple less places now as a junior for long-term health, brain development, body development, success in the sport. If you're going for, there's got to be like 3 of you, but if you're going for a 16-year-old, some kind of national championship, sure, do it for a little short period of time. Try to get down to that weight. And then afterwards, know, hey, I'm not going to do this for 4 years in high school, opposed to maybe I'm going to have a 2 or 3 month period where I'm going to be lightweight, to Chad's point too. So Keegan, just don't worry about it. You're going to thank yourself when you're like, right, everyone? And when you're in your 20s and 30s, you're going to be like so glad that you lived a little bit when you were younger, rather than live this monk existence, maybe change the way your body's developed. The brain development alone, that is so huge. Like, don't do it, Keegan. Off soapbox.
We're all nodding here, by the way, on YouTube. So you can see that we all agree. So hopefully that helps. And we actually, one of our riders on staff here, Megan, she's awesome. She actually was really kind of when NICA was first kind of starting out. She was going through the whole process in the NorCal League of going through that whole thing. So she's particularly passionate about this topic. So we haven't exactly decided when or what we'll do, but we do certainly intend on putting together some sort of guide for juniors and training and that sort of stuff. So stay tuned for that, and that'll be on the TrainerRoad blog. Okay, this is a really common question that we get in one regard or another from Nick. He says, I'm confused as to what type of road cyclist I am, which, first of all, Nick, you can be whatever you want to be because you're not paid. But anyways, so going beyond that, he says, I'm a freshman in college, and throughout high school, I did mid-distance track and cross-country and rode only in the summer. My best events were the 1,000 meters, and he had a PB of 247, and the mile, which he had a PB of 456. I was never, and he says this, he says, I was never good at anything shorter than a 400 or longer than a mile. My power tests on the bike resembled this with, he says, a horrible, man, people are harsh on themselves, right? My power tests on the bike resembled this with a horrible sprint and threshold in relation to my fairly strong anaerobic power. So this is my first year as a full-time cyclist, and while my power has improved in all areas, I feel that my strength is now shifting toward threshold power. Nate's mentioning that his computer is dying, by the way. So Nate might disappear on the podcast for a while, and hopefully we can get him back. So, so Nate, if you disappear, we'll still be here for you. So he says, am I losing my puncher capabilities as I do all this sweet spot and threshold work? Or will it come back when I finally enter the specialty phase? How should I go about finding my rider type? So the core part of this question, before we go about answering like how should he find his rider type, but this is the really common one that we find. People wonder if steady state work hurts their short power, right, Chad? That's like the question that we hear. And if you focus on one, the other one falls off, is the assumption.
Yeah, and probably just temporarily. I mean, if anything, he's laying a wider base, a greater foundation, a stronger foundation for better anaerobic work down the line. Because anything you do that enforces that aerobic foundation will later reinforce what you can do anaerobically. And I do recognize that there is a trade-off. If you focus strictly on anaerobic, it's going to come at some expense to your aerobic system and vice versa. But I don't think that's really what we're talking about here. Right now, you got a temporary shift trying to grow your muscle endurance because you assume you're not good at efforts longer than, the 400 or the mile. Well, first question is, did you ever train for distances that were longer than the 400 or the mile? Because you got to put in the work. You may not be naturally good at those things, but it doesn't mean you can't get good at those things. Yeah, there's a genetic predisposition. It just so happens that maybe the next question or a question in this week's podcast has to do with genetics. So I'm going to table that for now, but don't get too hung up on these so-called genetic limitations. In your case, maybe you do have a genetic predisposition towards high anaerobic capacity, anaerobic power, and that just means that it's going to come back that much easier when you do decide to focus on it again. So now you're just elevating one aspect of your fitness, and it's a very important one. And then when you come back and target those things that you're already good at, you've just got a wider base upon which to build that strength of yours. And then just know, and if you've listened to the podcast, you've heard this: short power develops and returns quickly. So yeah, it may dissipate quickly, but that means it comes back. That means it comes back quickly. If you don't have it in the first place, you can probably train a decent level of it pretty quickly. And bonus on top of it, if you happen to be detrained, well, I guess in any case, detraining leads to anaerobic adaptations. So I mean, honestly, you could just take a break from the bike for a little while and it would shift things a little more anaerobically.
Yeah, this is an interesting point. I see like a lot of the time. So in golf, it's always talked about on short game versus off the tee. And when you focus on your game off the tee, your short game usually suffers. And those magical days are when you actually are not bad at one or the other, right? And you're actually good. That's when you get, closest to, when you're inching closer to par. But cycling, yes, specificity absolutely is in place, right? Like you were saying there, Chad. And sure, there may be some sort of genetic predispositions, but and certainly I don't mean this in any regard, Nick, as like a slight, but all of us here are average people in the sense that we aren't like the pointy end of some sort of performance level in sport, right? So because of that, we're probably not getting close to our genetic limitations. So in that case, it's much more about what you train is what you can be good at, right? But it's and so I guess that I'll just leave it at that. That's an important thing. Amber, you have some stuff to add on too.
Chad,
Sorry.
do you want to jump in
really quickly?
Sure.
Yeah, so Nick, also, I didn't mention, if for whatever reason you need to maintain this anaerobic capacity, maybe it's important right now, maybe you're racing through a training block sort of thing, you can always touch up that system. And this is another thing we've hit on many times. It doesn't take a heck of a lot. So maybe you have a very sweet spot or muscle endurance focused block. Maybe whatever phase you're in, there's nothing to say you can't sprinkle in, and it doesn't even have to be a dedicated workout, but a bit of anaerobic work. I mean, you can just add a couple anaerobic efforts to a sweet spot workout, maybe toward the tail end, or you can do a very short anaerobic workout and probably see to it that none of your anaerobic capacity and power diminish at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say, to your point about having come from a different sport and you're kind of mapping your strengths and weaknesses from another sport onto cycling. I did the same thing when I first started cycling, and boy, was I wrong. So as most of you probably know, I was a swimmer before I was a cyclist, and my swimming strengths were mostly mid to long distance. I wasn't a long distance, but I was sort of 200, 400 meter swimmer. And I really, as a swimmer, I didn't have much of a sprint. Like I would say that I couldn't really sprint to save my life. And so when I started cycling, this is really, really early on before I really started to understand tactics too. Like in my very first collegiate cycling races, I would end up in a break of 4 and I wouldn't even contest the sprint at the finish. And I remember after watching me like not contest the sprint at the finish of a race at one point, one of my teammates was like, "Why didn't you sprint?" And I just shrugged and said, "Well, I've never been able to sprint as a swimmer. Like I can't sprint." And she kind of looked at me like, "Have you ever tried?" And I was so utterly convinced until she said that. And then I realized just in that moment, like how ridiculous it was that I was making this assumption, having not even tried. So anyway, the next day, I think this was like one of those collegiate weekends where you have 3 races on 3 days in a row. And so the very next day I was in another race and I was in a break and I contested the sprint that time. And I actually came in second and really surprised myself. I didn't expect that I would be able to do that. So just, don't paint yourself into a corner with this before you really, to Chad's point, before you've really actually tried to train some of these other strengths or weaknesses, you might surprise yourself. I would even venture to say that a sprint is probably one of the most trainable skills, not just because, because an effective sprint isn't just about raw power. I mean, that certainly helps, but it's also about how quickly you can accelerate. And a lot of that has to do with just neuromuscular speed and recruitment. It's not necessarily like you might not get up to the highest speed or the highest wattage, but if your rate of acceleration is higher than others around you, boy, is that an advantage. And a lot of that is just training leg speed. Successful sprints and attacks are really tactical. So it's all in the position, the timing, and the acceleration. It's not necessarily going to be, again, about that peak power output. So all of these things are things that you can train. And to Chad's point, training that neuromuscular speed and recruitment, sometimes that's just as simple as doing some really high cadence work at very low resistance. And that doesn't take that's not taxing because you're not putting out a lot of power. So, ignore your power and just see how fast you can get your cadence from like 80 to 150, 160, 180. See if you can even hit 200. I mean, why not? But that kind of neuromuscular recruitment and motor pattern training can give you a really nice acceleration, regardless of power output. So I wouldn't, don't paint yourself into a corner. Don't make assumptions until you've tried it. Just train it and see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Going to Kai's question, next one. He says, I follow a carb-centered diet, roughly 65% carbs and 20% protein and 15% fat. I slightly up my fat intake on recovery days and recovery weeks. Is there any science to back this up? That's the famous saying of ours, right? That we don't have any science to back up something that we're just going to interject, right? Every once in a while. But in this case, we're definitely looking into it from that lens. So he says, my idea is that I don't need to fill up on carbs as much during these periods due to the less glycolytic nature of the rides. And he mentions max 65% of FTP. He says, don't get me wrong, I still eat lots of carbs for recovery and get in the same amount of calories, maybe even more, but guess that this is the time to take in a bit more fat. So we've heard of like cycling carbs, and this is kind of like cycling fat in a certain way, but like basically like shifting your macro balance in one regard or another based on the work that you're doing. So when we were actually, Nate wasn't here on the original meeting for this episode, and I put in all caps, I put cage match on this one, because this one totally has the potential to devolve into a cage match if you were to talk to like a handful of randomly selected cyclists and see what they would think, right? Lots of opinions on this in terms of what's best. And in terms of what's possible, there's also a huge range of spectrum in terms of what's possible. In fact, I saw that we had somebody with the name Keto Rider watching right now on YouTube saying that he could do 400 kilometers without carbs. And it's like that's proving the point, right? There's a huge range. And while somebody else can do a whole lot on a lot of carbs, it's just, there's a lot. In other words, I don't know that there's a perfect balance, but we can definitely cover some really good points on this one. Chad, do you want to start off on this one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So not to dash anybody's hopes, but this is not going to be a steel cage match. This is just straight science, really. Essentially, I see the question is, what you're asking, Kai, is there a benefit to a macronutrient shift favoring fat intake on your recovery days and your recovery weeks while you cycle to a lower carb intake? And in that, I kind of take three questions that I want to address, and I'm going to at length address each of them, but first one's a long one. The second two go pretty rapidly. First off, I see the question as you're asking, you feel your diet is otherwise low on fat intake, either relatively or absolutely, maybe as a percentage of your macros, or maybe you just feel like you're not getting enough fat in general. And this is a chance for you to nourish in a more balanced manner. So with that in mind, the question maybe is more simply, why should fat be a concern for anyone? And I want to just talk about some of the benefits of fat in general, and both body fat, which is basically your white adipose tissue. There's also subcutaneous fat, which is basically that the body fat, visceral fat, which is the potentially very harmful kind, intramuscular fat. And this it's kind of an interesting one because within an athlete's muscles, it's typically a good thing. Within a sedentary person's muscles, it's typically a bad thing. And then we had a whole podcast or a whole segment of a podcast on brown adipose tissue and beige adipose tissue, which is the more metabolically active tissue that actually generates heat. Turns out fat in general does the same thing, just not to the same degree. And then there's also dietary fat, which is exogenous. Basically you have to intake this fat. It comes from your diet. So body fat comes from basically an excess of carbohydrate and protein. When you think of your liver and muscles store a certain amount of each, but once they fill up, or if your carbohydrate or protein intake exceeds that of the synthesis rate, it's got to be stored. So it gets stored as body fat. It can also come from the fats you intake. Same thing. I mean, those muscles get digested and the free fatty acids float around in your bloodstream and they get taken up by various body parts, but what doesn't has to be stored. Same with ethanol, alcohol. So alcohol intake basically just goes to fat. It's not all that useful physiologically. Okay, so body fat is basically it's an energy reserve. Without it, we'd have to match our energy consumption perfectly with our energy expenditure. We'd have to ingest just as much sugar as we needed to do the very thing that we're going to do, and then we'd have to stay on top of that all day long. So the essence of adipose tissue is energy management. It allows us to not be basically owned by carbohydrate intake or protein intake, whatever. It's also responsible for thermoregulation, and it's pretty clear that fat insulates externally because we can see it, but it also insulates internally. And we talk about the brown fat and the beige fat, but also the white fat has these same uncoupling proteins that we talked about in that episode that generate heat. They actually dissipate heat. And then also, every cell in your body is surrounded by a lipid cholesterol membrane. So fat is literally what keeps our cells intact. It forms the container within which our organelles and cytoplasm and all that stuff are contained. And some vitamins are only fat soluble. So again, if we didn't have this source to store these vitamins, we would have to stay on top of the ingestion of these particular vitamins on a daily basis, maybe a minute to minute basis. So you don't have vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K, the fat soluble ones. There's a long list on why each of those is vital to how our body functions. Then neural connections. So basically, also known as brain functions. So the axons, which are basically the wires in our neurons, which are the brain cells, are sheathed in myelin, similar to the way an electric wire is sheathed in a housing. And this is 80% of lipids.
I just want to jump in and to this point about the neurons. This is a really important point, and I just want to share a quick story. A friend of mine who's a former professional cyclist. So she's very disciplined. She knows how to train really hard. After she retired from professional cycling, she got into bodybuilding. And for her, relative to cycling, the actual training for bodybuilding felt like a cakewalk. So that part was super easy for her. The challenge was the diet. And so, was cutting the fat. And she was just so disciplined. The training aspect was so easy for her that the diet, she was able to adhere to the diet with more consistency than most athletes. She ended up having a grand mal seizure because her body fat dropped so low that the myelin sheaths in some of those neuronal connections were compromised, and she had a grand mal seizure. I mean, and instantly she was like, I'm done. I'm out. This is, it's not worth it. But this is a really, really important point. We forget that, fats are necessary for brain health as much as anything else.
Yeah, fats are necessary for quite a lot of things, as I hope you're getting the gist.
Yeah.
They in addition to this, so those sheaths, like I said, are comprised of roughly 80% fats, lipids. So other fatty acids actually serve as messengers. They send signals within our bodies. Linoleic acid is one of these. And a while back, we covered CLA, or conjugated linoleic acid, which is just one form of this particular fatty acid. And it serves as a signaling molecule that gives rise to some other fatty acids, eicosanoids, a family of which is prostaglandins. But in any case, it boils down to they affect our blood pressure. They modulate inflammation. They have a hand in muscle function. They have a hand in labor, childbirth. So chemical messengers as well. And then there's some evidence that fat intake is correlated with higher testosterone levels. Although the more I dug into that, the more I saw that's a pretty controversial point. So probably just should have omitted that. Sorry. Fat cells, finally, and this is the one that I consider most exciting to me, and just, I don't know, for the future of medicine, I suppose, is that fat cells contain potential stem cells. They can actually, there's evidence of taking fat cells via liposuction and regenerated them into what are called pluripotent cells, pluripotent stem cells. And basically that means that those cells become once again shapeable. They can steer them toward other ends, bone tissue, muscle tissue, etc. So quite literally, there is research right now that is taking fat cells and literally turning it into muscle. This is actually a thing. So that's fascinating.
That's
So
cool.
all of these things can take place when fat is broken down, and that process is called lipolysis. You probably heard us mention it a few times, but this assumes that you have a healthily functioning metabolism. And that's a big assumption, not so much in the athletic realm as it is in the more sedentary realm, but so many people these days fall on the metabolic disorder spectrum. So because fat can do all these things doesn't mean that fat is doing all these things. And then also these can take place when fat is ingested. So we can get it from a number of places, but what's important to recognize is how important that ingestion is, because the body doesn't really make fat. It's never going to pull from muscle tissue to use protein to create fat. It's not going to pull from glycogen stores to use sugar to make fat. We basically have to get it through excesses and through ingestion. So the takeaway for this first answer to this first question is that we need fat. We need to ingest it. We need to stockpile it. We would die without it. It is, in fact, an essential macronutrient. Protein's the other one. Carbohydrate is not. And it's important to everyone, athlete or not.
So something to add to this.
Two other questions to address, but jump in.
Yeah, one quick thing to this. So first of all, we can all hate our fat less, hopefully after this. So it does have a place for sure. And when we look at this too, I think that this is, I just wanted to point out really quickly that, Chad, this is like a really good way how you're laying this out, just your process of how you're going about this. It's really good. You're first looking at the subject at hand, trying to find its use, and then finding all the utility, and then going into the application behind it. So this is like, if I was to lay out like a rubric for basically like how you would go about solving any sort of questions or anything else that we have, this is a really good example of it. Nate, did you have something too? I saw you raise your hand. I don't know if... Okay, cool. Oh, I think we can't even hear Nate now. Nate's computer is melting. So hopefully he can come back soon. Okay, so we'll go. Yeah, bye-bye, Nate. Hopefully he can come back soon.
Hopefully be back.
Chad, go ahead. Sorry.
So two other ways I think, or maybe questions within the question that you're asking. The second is, you're doing low intensity work and slow twitch fibers prefer fat. So why wouldn't you fuel appropriately for the work at hand by increasing your fat and decreasing your carbohydrate intake? And it makes good sense, but do you really need to keep energy intake or calories evenly high? You're not doing as much work. You're shifting. If it's a recovery week or recovery day, well, recovery week, let's just keep it in that context. You're probably not doing as much overall training load, and therefore you probably don't need as much calories on the intake side of things. On top of it, you probably have a ton of different types of fat stores that are brimming with excess. May not seem like it, but even in the leanest athletes, there's a lot of available fat on a human body. And then also consider that fat is super calorie dense, and it could, from an endurance athlete's perspective, affect body composition unfavorably, both in terms of appearance and performance. So 100 grams of carbohydrate, if you replace that gram for gram with fat, you're going to get over 2 times the calories. And this is okay if you're upping your mileage, you're doing low intensity work, but you're doing a ton of it. In that case, I wouldn't find any fault in this approach. But if you're reducing your training volume over the course of a recovery week, I think it's probably going to lead to a little excess body fat, which isn't really going to serve any benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then finally, does all of this apply to recovery days just as it applies to recovery weeks? And my take on this, probably not. Recovery days often have a higher replenishment requirements. You're either loading up for tomorrow's training or you're refilling from yesterday's. And while some reduction in carbohydrate intake is probably a good idea because the training load is lower, an increase in fat intake to compensate for it is probably unnecessary.
This is like a good point here in this section where, so carb cycling is really common. commonly spoken about, I should say. Fat cycling isn't very commonly spoken about, but we covered it here. That's for sure. But on the carb cycling side, and this will be a good mic test to see if Nate's mic works, but this is like a thing where a lot of people, yeah, we're testing it. We're doing it live right now, people. But a lot of people. So I think that it's pretty easy to take this too far, I guess, on the cycling side of things, right? In the sense that like periodizing your nutrition is important, but it's also pretty easy to go like severe, like where you basically go like, I'm training today, feeling adequately, not training today, so I'm just going to cut it clean, whatever sort of macro you're targeting or anything else like that. It's kind of easy to go too far, would you say, Chad?
Yeah, it is. I think the term here is being misused too, because carbohydrate cycling versus fueling for the workouts are two different things. Carbohydrate cycling, I think, is more ketogenic nomenclature. We're looking at times where you don't have you have very little carbohydrate in your diet, and you're going to cycle carbs into your diet to perform in a more glycolytic event. I don't think it's the same thing. I think we're really simply talking about changing our diet based on the work demands ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Nate, let's see if your mic works. It works. Yes, you're
good.
there.
Okay. So yeah, no, Chad and I are in complete agreement on all of this. I just have a strategy to kind of help with this. Is I think what boils down to is for percentages that doesn't hold very well when you think about the different amount of volume that you're going to do on different days. Mm-hmm. So Chad was talking about like you might have a 5,000 calorie day, or you might have a 2,000 calorie day based on where you are in your training. And if you hold the percentages the same, your fat intake and your protein intake might go drastically higher. So I like the idea of thinking of it as minimum protein and fat grams that you need for proper health. And then with the rest of your training, that scales with carbohydrate. So I was just looking up for endurance athletes, and correct me if I'm wrong, everyone, but generally, the recommendation is between 1 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight for endurance athletes. So if you do that with the 20% protein, if you have a 5,000 calorie day, I closed my window, but I think that was 250 grams of protein, that is a lot. That's like bodybuilder level. So if you think about these huge days, and two, you see the Tour de France guys, they'll have huge days of protein, but that's also because they're eating like 5,000 or 6,000 calories. And there's not many foods that you can eat that are palatable that don't have some protein in it. So if they're eating brown rice and oatmeal, they're still getting protein the whole time. It's really hard to keep protein down. And then fat, I can't remember off the top of my head, but Chad, do you know what the amount of grams of fat is for these health benefits that you need absolutely per day?
Man, I don't.
If not, we can look it up and do it next time. Yeah, I want to say you need at least like 20 to 30, or else you're going to be in like big trouble, like you just mentioned and how Amber mentioned. But in general, think about it that way. And then the rest can be carbohydrates. And a lot of that carbs too, you might get on those big days. It's just on the bike fueling. And that's like your kind of extra that you get throughout the day. And the rest is fibrous vegetables and that sort of thing, and lean meats in order to kind of make this work. But if you only go on percentages, it's going to be really hard to do when you get those big calorie volume days. You go on a 5-hour ride, it's hard to do 20% protein, 15% fat. John, you had something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that's how I found the most sustainable way to manage this is to increase the amount that I'm taking in on the bike. And that way I can kind of keep everything else more sustained and focused around general health. And then that way, when I'm on the bike, I'm getting the fuel I need. I'm also getting the benefit of training my body to be able to process carbohydrate when it's in this, working state like this and figure that out. So it's all like a lot of, I feel like that's one of the things that I've found is the best way to control this whole thing and to make it really easy and sustainable. I don't have to ask a lot of questions that way. It's just like, yep, I'm fueling my work because I'm doing more work in that time. Thereafter, it's more about, just maintaining. And I do eat something that's probably around like a 60% carbs, 65% carbs on a typical daily, average. So it's not like I'm low carb or anything like that. But I definitely, when I train, I ramp it up. Go ahead, Nate.
And to further Chad's point on how glycolytic your workouts are. So in like the first 3 weeks of a plan, you might be eating more carbs in the recovery week. The actual kilojoules or calories might be the same, but the glycolytic demand is way less, right? So my
Yes.
advice would be, I would not try to deplete your glycogen stores anymore during that time. I want to keep them at the same level or probably up a little bit, but it doesn't need to be the same percentage as if you're doing sweet spot work, these long over-unders, a whole bunch of VO2 max work, or longer rides that could deplete glycogen even more. So that's another thing to keep in mind in it. But I think we're all in a agreement, like recovery week is not the week to lose weight. Recovery week is not the week to like do drastic changes in diet, because what you're really doing is you're prepping for the next 3 weeks. We talk about always having a workout, like make sure your easy days don't come at the sacrifice of your hard days. Make sure your recovery weeks don't then sacrifice your build weeks. Because if your build weeks don't happen, like you're not going to get any faster.
Yes. Yeah. If I could add to this too, I think that that's like a good example of me trying to respect how hard that build loading phase will get as I'm going through that right now. Like I'm super tempted to go back on the train that I was following over the past 2 weeks of doing morning workouts that are lower intensity. They're not that hard. They sit somewhere around 50% intensity and it's just an hour long. And it's a fun social thing with doing group workouts. And I get to do it with all the people that we work with here since we don't have the office right now. It's nice to be able to get in touch with everybody. But because I have a new FDP and because I know that this is, one of the hardest points in the build plan right now that I'm in, I'm not doing those workouts yet. Because and during the recovery week, I did not skimp. I ate like normal and I carried through the whole process because I don't want to basically take the opportunity that I have to get the most benefit and blunt that. I want that to be absolutely free and able to carry me up, and to whatever fitness level I need. So yeah, it's a great point. Go ahead, Nate.
I also think, so we talked about, we're doing Petit +1 early morning for the company. I think that's actually probably too much to add, at least for a lot of us, to add extra volume if we're on a high volume plan. I started doing Coliseum -3, which is a lot less. And it's just enough where I want to say it is like 55, where Petit goes up to like 65. That little 10% difference is huge. And it feels like, I think we should just change that ride to make it easier, especially being early morning. Those, at least for me, that makes it really hard when I get out of bed. Chad?
No, I think you're exactly right. I've recognized over the years that the difference between 50% and 60% when you need an easy day carries a ton of weight. So what you experience is 60% versus that 50% can be the difference between actually getting recovered and being ready for your next hard ride and being just a little bit flat, not bringing everything to the table. So I think you're right. And in the interim, I do suggest that if you feel like that's inspiring further fatigue, knock it down 5, 10%. You're still going to get just about everything, if not more, out of that workout than was intended.
And I think this is another good argument for doing your recovery rides inside. Because a lot of the time when I do those recovery rides or those easy rides and I'm riding outside, I subconsciously just, the power drifts up, right? But the nice part about doing it inside and then having like structure and you're adhering to that is you make sure that you don't drift into 60. Because like you said, or whatever, just don't drift up. Because like you said, the difference can be profound. Even though it's a few percentage points, it can be profound. So Kenneth's question. This one's great too. One that a lot of people have asked in one way or another. Says, hey all, excellent podcast, 5 stars all the way. I've been thinking about how it's easier to regain what fitness or strength you once had, comparing it to building it from scratch. Would this have any bearing on the performance potential of a newer but older athlete? So we'll get into some more details on that question. He says, I'm about to hit 40 and have been seriously training for triathlon for about 2 years. Previously, I was active, but not racing or doing anything truly structured. Am I forever behind, say, an athlete my age who did structured training their whole life? Or can I catch up to them given enough time and training? I know genetics play a role, and I work at a hospital. And he says, when I worked at a hospital when I was 25 years old, I had access to a lab for VO2 Max test. And I scored a 71, and that's milliliters per kilogram per minute. So that's a relatively high score, 71. So that's very high. That would indicate a very fit person, right? Like a 71 would be good. So So he says, I assume my genetics would support good performance eventually. So kind of going back to the core of the question, he's really asking about two things, genetics and then also age, right, Chad? Those two things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I gotta admit, right from the start here, Kenneth, I focused on that final question or the final paragraph there about genetics. So I'm hoping everyone else will kind of toe the line when it comes to the remainder of this question. So this has been my particular area of interest lately. And by lately, I mean probably the last year or so, is the study of genetics and how it imposes these so-called limitations on our performance ceilings, and how we can work to affect our genetic, again, so-called limits. And I've read a number of books. I'm in the process of reading a number of others, but one that I've come back to and I'm actually rereading because I think I am gleaning a whole lot more useful information this time around is David Epstein's The Sport Gene, which honestly, just from a sport enthusiast perspective, is a really interesting read. So it doesn't matter what you take from it. If you just want to be entertained, I recommend it. So one study in particular that he cites in a lot of books that are looking at performance through the genetics lens is the Heritage study, and that stands for Health Risk Factors, Exercise Training, and Genetics. So just Heritage, and they took 98 previously untrained 2-generation families, so kids and their folks, and looked at their response to identical regular exercise regimens. This was in total 481 participants, and it took them 4 years to figure out, to interpret the data, collect the data, do everything they needed to do. The goal being to see whether genes, one of the many goals, was to see whether genes played a part in how fit one person could get compared to another. Actually, the overarching goal was to personalize or figure out, ways to personalize medicine, medical treatments, et cetera. Their findings was that VO2 max improved anywhere from 0% to 50%. So I think this may have been the inception of the whole high responders versus low responders. That may be where this all started. And what was so interesting is that changes were really similar within families, but were disparate between families. And also interesting is that everyone experienced health benefits of one form or another. So even if they didn't see an improvement in VO2 max, they saw some form of improvement, blood cholesterol, insulin sensitivity, something. Further, what was also very interesting is that the changes had nothing to do with their starting capabilities. And this was what helped researchers and sports scientists differentiate between baselines and responses. So baselines don't define you. So in your case, Ken, yeah, you have a 71 straight out of the gates, and I don't know what amount of training went into elevating it to 71, or maybe that's where you started, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be this stellar high performer. It might, because there's a combination between having a low baseline and being a high responder, having a high baseline being a low responder, both of which can basically net the same gain. And then the holy grail, of course, is having a high baseline and being a high responder. And optimistically, that's what you are. And starting at a 71 mils per min per kilogram is ridiculous. I mean, that is an amazing place to start. And it hints at great potential, but it doesn't ensure it. Also, just another note is that low responders to one type of exercise can be high responders to another. So even if you do at some point are classified as a low responder, don't take that as gospel. You might be a low responder to that particular exercise intervention, but it doesn't mean that's the only way you're going to get faster. And therefore you need to abandon all hope. So the takeaway for the first part of my presentation here is that genetics is only one part of this equation. The second part is how we influence our genetics. And I don't want to dive into epigenetics here. I think there are going to be better opportunities to do that. But I do want to say that, well, yes, genetics probably do determine our potential. They kind of set the ceiling. How we influence our genetics decides on how much of that potential we're going to exploit. And man, we can attack that from so many different angles, training being the most obvious, but also diet, our sleep, our stress management, the types and levels of socialization in which we engage, our mental outlook in so many ways. That's very multifaceted. Our environment, also very multifaceted. And yes, age is going to impact this ability to express our genetic potential, or maybe our genetic potential just kind of degrades as we age. I don't know. It doesn't matter. The slope for you, Ken, isn't all that slippery just yet. You're only 40 years old. And when it comes to endurance sports, you're actually sitting in a pretty prime spot, especially with the 71 VO2 max.
This is so like the big thing that I see a lot of people asking with this is like, because cycling and triathlon in general are kind of like adult onset sports in a lot of ways. It's changing, and like it's definitely something where we're seeing more young people come into. But you always have the big question, like Nate, you've mentioned this a handful of times, that like you played in band, you were not like the typical like athlete, right? So then you came into this late, and I'm sure you had the question of like, well, am I ever going to be as fast as these people, right? Like you feel like you're always behind.
Are you saying that marching band people aren't athletes? Because people was pretty heavy that I carried around.
Don't you put those words in my mouth. Don't do that.
I did the bass drum too for drumline. No, but still, I didn't care, right? Like I did it for my own fun, and I wasn't gonna like start to be like, oh, if I can never be a high level national athlete, like I'm not gonna do it. Just like, who cares? Let's just do it because it's fun. And so that's why triathlon's so great too. You race against yourself, supportive community. And it's like a great way to get into the sport. I want to say something too about the high responders. This is why John is going to destroy us in an Ironman, because John ran like 3 times, and then he ran a 19-minute 5K. His
18,
baseline
18.
is hot. What was 18?
18 minutes. Oh. Yeah, it was 18.
What? Yeah. I thought it was not. It was not. 18 is insane, John.
Yeah, it was 18.
So for everyone listening who's a runner, that is okay. I've never ran my fastest 5K was like 19:10. And that's after lots of running. Your baseline is so much higher than us, and we know you respond to training. So as soon as John starts actually running, and if he doesn't get injured, you are going to. I mean, sounds like a 15-minute 5K is in the realm for you, and that I think you're plenty durable, and we know about collagen now, and you're good at PT, like you're gonna destroy us. You're going to beat us by like 45 minutes.
Everything's safe.
I'm saying is, a lot of things to be able to reduce injury rate, where you might I was kind of not smart with it and just plod around and get injured running all the time. Plus, you're not very heavy. Like compared to
that's my biggest concern.
You're the lightest one here. Yeah.
Yeah.
And weight
injury is just.
Yeah. So
sorry, Nick, go ahead.
No, I'm done.
Injury is my biggest concern for sure. Like, and so, but externalizing myself from this whole thing, I feel like we all can, like VO2 max scores. And first of all, like depending on the sport that you've done and how you've trained and everything else, it can totally change. And we do definitely have a tendency to put a lot into that, and with good reason, because it's a measure of it's a measure that can indicate performance potential and plenty of other stuff. Amber, as a pro, did you do much VO2 max testing when you were a pro athlete?
I didn't do a lot, but I did do a couple tests early on in my career. I think my number was 67, and a couple of funny notes about that. The first one I did, if anybody's ever done one of those tests, you're not supposed to stand up during the test because it needs to be consistent, and so you stay seated while you're testing. And I didn't know that because whatever I was doing, didn't know what I was doing, and so I think at some point well into the test, I stood up, and all of the researchers in the lab just went, collectively, and it startled me so badly that my heart rate skyrocketed, and then it was just kind of screwed things up, so we had to redo that.
That's funny.
And then the same researchers actually mentioned that they had, when they were telling me, initially how to do it, they said, okay, I think it was maybe the second test, but they said, when you finish your effort or whatever, you have to spin down for an extra 10 minutes. And I kind of looked at them like, really? Like, I'm going to have to keep pedaling after all of that? And they're like, no, you have to cool down, because before we had the cool down included in the protocol, one of the athletes stopped pedaling and actually threw up into the fan that they had pointed at the athlete, which was, a bad scene. So anyway, just some VO2 Max testing stories. It's good times. But the funny thing about VO2 Max is it's a number, it's a data point, but it's not something that's necessarily going to, as Chad was saying, it's not the end all. It's not the end of your story. It's not going to determine anything per se. It's one data point that you can use, but that, especially in triathlon, there's so many things that go into being a fast athlete. I mean, there's your position on the bike, there's your transition speed, there's your technique in the water, there's your pacing strategies. I mean, there's a whole lot that goes into this. Chad and I, when we did it, we were 62. I'd like to think that I've raised it from then. John was 68.
Amber 67, and like 70s, that's high enough for like domestic pro, or even higher depending on all those other intangibles or other just physiology traits. We've heard of some pros like in the Tour de France be in the 60s. And then I think Tour de France winners, I can't think of one that wasn't below 80. Like, I don't know if anyone else can think of anyone off the top of their head.
I can't. No.
But then what's Cavendish? Cavendish has like notoriously, quote unquote bad numbers, but
I think he's in the
wildly
60s.
Successful athlete. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it just goes to show that it's a number and it can mean something for sure. But it also, to your point, Chad, a baseline doesn't mean a lot in terms of what you can be as an athlete. And also, depending on the training that you do, you could respond entirely differently to it. So it's pretty cool to think of it in that regard. And I think, and hopefully what we can come away with from this question is that, as far as genetics are concerned, genetics are not something hard coded that can never change, but this is something that, and they aren't hard limitations, right? But this is something that the training process and everything else creates the person who you are, and that can change and have influence for generations. That's like, I kind of look at that and I'm kind of excited to like, hopefully all the training that I've done will help out my son, right? And carry that on and help out with those further generations. Hopefully it changes that. Amber, go ahead.
I just want to tie this back into what we were talking about earlier. It's just another place to underscore having that mindset of curiosity. Like, nothing's predetermined. Go, embrace this with curiosity. Like, hey, I'm starting when I'm 40. Let's see what I can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. So let's go into the last question here. Then we'll get into some of the live questions that you've submitted on YouTube. So thank you for doing that. This one is from Micah and says, I'm new to cycling and appreciate your podcast. It's taught me so many things about training over the last 3 months. And I'm sure the coaches, especially Chad and Amber, have done nearly every type of interval workout there is. What is your favorite workout and why? So we can probably go through and explain those. Chad, kick us off with your faves.
Yeah, I like to work for shorter periods of time at the higher end of things. And I've recognized over time that there's a high level of productivity available there, but also they just hurt less. It's shorter, sweeter pain. When you drag it out, man, it can be a mentally very difficult thing to deal with. I do have phases where I appreciate steady state work like Sweetspot work. And there are phases where I like to just get it done super quickly and super intensely with sprint work. But pretty much at all times, I do not like threshold and over-unders and even anaerobic. So I like basically VO2 Max to sprint kind of seems to be where I fall. In particular, I like short shorts. So don't confuse this with when I say I like VO2 Max work, that I like doing 2 and 3 minute repeats at 120-ish% of threshold, because I hate those. They're awful. However, short shorts, which achieve basically the same ends, and it could be argued even better performance gains, are absolutely my bread and butter. So Ansel Adams, Taylor, Gendarme, Spencer, Brasted, Kidstone's, Clouds Rest. Those are all examples in our catalog, and I love those workouts. I think my favorite overall right now, and one I'm going to return to right now to see if I can maybe do something between now and the next FTP assessment in 4 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever, is Brasted. And if you look at Brasted, the format of it is, I mean, that's directly stolen from this basically Ronstadt's study. And then they just published another study with Nygaard and Lundby called Short Intervals versus Effort Matched Long Intervals, where they found that format yielded improvements in peak power output, fractional utilization of VO2 max, so at 4 millimoles. So basically how much of your VO2 max you're relying at 4 millimoles of, basically lactate threshold for many. And your power output at that same lactate threshold. So let's just say FTP. And it brought better changes with the short format than it did the 2 and 3 and 4 minute intervals. I think that's what they compared. Anyway, longer intervals, all with no change in VO2 max. So again, it was like they took what they had and they figured out ways to eke more work out of it, more, higher power outputs out of the same unchanged VO2 max. And because of that, I've glommed onto that format and I've utilized that format enough to recognize that it's really solid, and it's something that I don't hate doing because it just doesn't get as painful as the more sustained efforts do.
I'd love to be able to share or like show these workouts right now on the live stream. By the way, I apologize, I can't. We're figuring out the live stream setup right now. So if we were to share our screen right now, you wouldn't be able to hear us. So we're we're working through that. Next week we'll have it all figured out. Amber, how about you?
I'm right in line with Chad there. I love the short shorts because for me, one of the things I learned over the course of my career about how my body responds to training is I respond really well to those VO2 level efforts. But like Chad, I hate those 3-4 minute efforts. They're awful.
So painful.
Suffered through many of those. Yes, they're a necessity to really build out that energy system. But I love the short shorts because I feel like I'm doing something substantial. I'm getting a really good workout, but I don't, it's fun. It keeps my focus. I'm engaged. I feel like I'm really doing some work, and it doesn't destroy me. So yeah, and I don't know, just my body likes those and responds well to them. So those are my favorites. So I would say Bracelet and Taylor along those lines are two of my favorites.
For me, I put down a handful of ones. I've grown to like every type of interval workout, more or less, in one form or another. And I put down ones that I really like look forward to. And I went back and looked through like the training that I've done over the past like 6 months. And I looked at those workouts and I was like, oh yeah, I do like that one when it comes up. So first one in Sweetspot, I love Tonabora. And that one basically, if you look at it, it's all together, it's 7 minutes of Sweetspot that you do. But it starts out at 94% for a minute, then goes to 92%, then 90, then 88, and then it just steps back up. But it's incredible how fast it goes by. And it's like a very kind workout on you, physically speaking, because it ramps you down, then brings you back up. So like that's like, if anybody struggles with Sweetspot, I really recommend Tonabora as one to kind of like get your feet wet, so to speak. Then for openers, I like a workout called Crane. Also, if you just don't have a lot of time, for some reason don't have anything you're supposed to do that day, and instead you just want to do something that feels like you've done something hard and fun, it's not going to give you a bunch of kilojoules, but Crane is a blast, and that's CRANE. And that one I use for my openers pretty regularly. Like I mentioned earlier, it's 30 seconds at 165%, followed by a minute at 92%. So it's just that hard start like a race, and then you just pin it just below threshold, but it's short enough so that the pain doesn't actually hit you too hard. You can kind of escape it, but feel like you're doing something cool. And then a challenging one that I really like is Basin. That one just ramps up and continues to ramp up and continues to ramp up in these interval sets that basically I think that they last somewhere around like 4 minutes long, somewhere around there. And it just ramps up continually. And that one's really tough. Go ahead, Chad.
Just as a note, in our video, The Chase with Justin Rossi, that's the workout he's doing there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So I like it a lot. It's a great one, and it'll make you feel, if you can get, like, when you get through that one, it's not an if, you totally should be able to get through that one, but when you do it, you should feel really like proud of yourself. And it's those sort of efforts where it's like, it's ramping up. It's kind of like when the pace is lifting on a climb. It feels cool. So, but then I think that my favorite sort of workout structure by far are, I guess you could call them, Chad, am I misstepping by calling Xalibu, which Xalibu, Xalibu. First of all, that should totally be the name, or should have been the name of an American gladiator. It shouldn't have been Malibu. It should have been Xalibu for sure. But just Malibu with an X. Why not? But that one, it's kind of like it's like a hard start or race winner interval, but then it's followed by that Billat structure of the higher intensity over unders, make them shorter and stretch them up and down, so to speak. Right, Chad?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's those reduced amplitude billouts. So we repeat 15-15s, but your recovery is done at 88% of threshold. So it's challenging over the entire course of the interval, but it does a really good job of not only stimulating, improvements in your aerobic capacity, but also stimulating what you face in a criterium, a mountain bike race, really any hard start race that has punchy efforts afterward.
Yep. So this one is short power build, and then outside of short power build, if you go into like a cross country Olympic cyclocross, like you mentioned, that's where those plans are filled with these sort of workouts. So Nate will get to do Xalibu at some point too, I think, with short power build. So Nate, you like Baxter, obviously, right? But what else?
Which one's that?
No way.
Yeah.
So the I don't know about which ones I like. I really like any of them, but the ones that like bump up my fitness would be right peak. So I feel like when I can do right peak, I could really race well, and that's 3 by 30 minutes. That's a sweet spot and pretty high. I think it's like 90 or above. It's a hard one, but I feel like when I can do that, I'm like I have more muscular endurance than most people in like a road race, and I feel this might be all mental, but I'm like, they're going to fall off before I do, which I like. And earlier I talked about the low amplitude billets, and I said Friel. I was wrong. Flume +2. That's one I just did. There's a whole progression of that in Sweet Spot or in Short Power Build. They're in the cross plans. I'm thinking I don't do a lot of these. I haven't done them for a long time, but based on how I felt and how like deep I went, I just had a new FTP increase too. But how hard I was breathing, I think this is going to be a really awesome one in this plan to help raise my VO2 max, because I've done a lot of like raising my my muscular endurance over the years, that I think I'm going to respond really well to this plan of Short Power Build and coming into nationals for crit and see what happens. But I think as of now, that's my favorite.
Sweet. Okay, we're going to get into a handful of live questions that people have submitted. First one's from Terry. Says, I finished build and all my events got canceled through June. So my A event is probably going to be canceled as well. So and the question is, should I go back to base 1 or base 2, which our base plan, basically it's split into 2 halves, more or less. So that's for people that aren't TrainerRoad subscribers, that's what he's referring to. Or should I just keep on going? I want to be fresh for fall mountain bike races. What's the best approach? Terry, best approach is to use Plan Builder, number 1, instead of thinking about like which blocks you need to place in, because that's what Plan Builder will do for you. And in my opinion, if you want to be fresh for fall mountain bike races, then you should you can put for now just like a faux specialty event if you want. Put your A race in the fall in the meat of where you're supposed to be doing those mountain bike races, and then train for that moving forward. That's what I would do personally. So like Plan Builder works even if your event is fake. That's a pro tip. So you can toss it on there and it'll still work very functionally for you and bring you to the fitness that you need at that time. Okay. Another one from Giovanni says, what's the best cadence while doing a ramp test? Giovanni mentions, I found myself spinning way faster and I felt like I got tired earlier. I do the ramp test in resistance mode, so I'm shifting gears, so it's kind of like changing throughout. What would you say, Nate?
I was going to say 82. Just kidding. There is no like just do whatever you need to do. There's been a lot like research on this. Self-selected cadence is the best. And I think too, every time you finish a ramp test, everyone feels this. I've talked to lots of users about it. You're like, I could have lasted like 4 more seconds. Like after like 3 minutes later, you look back and you're like, I got 352. I'm like, I could have got 353 for sure. Like, you know what I mean? And then you always think of like little things that like brought you down because of the test. As long as you're not in some extreme, like your 60 RPM or your 130 RPM, just don't even worry about it. Just go what feels best in the moment. And it might change as you go through different power outputs, and don't worry about it.
My advice with the ramp test.
Sorry.
My advice is simply don't try to manage a ramp test. Just show up, be prepared to do work, and just hang in there for as long as you can.
Adam actually asks, how often should I redo the ramp test? My answer would be as frequent as it's scheduled within your training plan. And if it's not, we usually say every 4 to 6 weeks, right, Chad?
Yep. That's about the time course for adaptation. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Let's see. Next one. Okay. This one says, I'm 15 and aspiring to be a pro, and I think I've got good numbers. What do you recommend? So that's pretty basic, straight out there, Felix. But I hope that you paid attention during that nutrition one, the topic that we talked about there. And then in terms of training for a junior, I can't emphasize enough what Amber said in terms of keeping curiosity peaked and maintaining enthusiasm. Also know that enthusiasm will not maintain itself. but that is something that can be found through freshening up goals, changing approaches, exploring something new. That's definitely important. And also like a support group is huge with that too, having people to help with that. But in terms of something specific, Felix, prepare for your goals, but don't do so at the cost of anything, anything, I guess, bring your enthusiasm down for the sport. Nate, go ahead.
I was just talking about this on a ride yesterday. I'm trying, like, pro cyclist life, and Amber, I want your opinion on this, is one of the hardest jobs in the world in terms of effort, like away from your family, what you have to do all the time. And some pros, like if you're winning Tour de France, you're making a lot of money. You're Peter Sagan, you're making a lot of money. Other than that, some pros domestically, you might make $9,000 a year. Like it's just insane. It's a hard life to do, and you have to be so genetically gifted to make a ton of money and be like well off. You got to really, really like that lifestyle to be. Oh, I mean, Amber, you made sacrifices. I'm sure you're away from your husband a lot. There's no partying. Socialization is all different. You're on 24 hours a day, right? It's not like other jobs where you could do other stuff. You can still have a lot of fun in the sport and be successful and have a normal job. Amber, you want to talk about your experiences in that?
Yeah, it's being a professional cyclist, it's really hard, and making that jump, even so that the transition, the pathway we would imagine, right, is that you kind of move your way up through the ranks, the amateur ranks, and then you maybe get to connect with your national team, eventually have a pro contract. There's a lot of differences between racing at a high level, in the elite amateur ranks versus in the professional ranks. To your point, Nate, it involves a lot of sacrifice. It sounds like you love the sport and this is something that, you really want to pursue. And if you do, that's great. Just know that it does come with a lot of challenge. I did really love it. There were a lot of things about it I did not love, but I think that's kind of the case with most jobs. But, get real about
not here
what it is. Yeah, no, TrainerRoad's awesome. Don't get me wrong. But get real about what being a professional cyclist is. Reach out to pros. I mean, honestly, pros are just people. Like you can reach out to, especially in the UK, maybe reach out to somebody who's a high level in the high level cyclist near you, or send an email. I mean, oftentimes the high level athletes, they're happy to chat with juniors about their experience. Get a real insider's perspective on what this takes. The other piece of it, I would say, is that it's a business. You have to learn how to manage yourself as a business. You have to learn how to lay out a budget, manage your own logistics in a lot of cases. If you're on a contract that's paying you $9,000 a year, how are you going to make that work? So the sponsorship, the business side of it, that's a whole different kettle of fish from just focusing on your training and your racing and your performance. And that is a big component that comes in later on that does become very important. Learning how to negotiate contracts. I mean, these are all skills that you don't really think about when you're just lining up to start a bike race. So I really do recommend talking to somebody who's been there. And then the other piece, I just want to reiterate what Jonathan said about a support group. Build a village now. So what I mean by that is find people who are in your life who will be steadfast and follow you throughout your career. So you may be jumping from one team to another. You may have a different coach year to year. I strongly advise you to find a coach that you can work well with, that will stick with you, regardless of what team you're on. But having a stable village of people around you that you trust to have your personal interest at heart, not your personal interest as an athlete, but your personal interest as a human being. So that those people will be the people that kind of ground you, help you maintain a good grasp on the bigger picture, and they can help you evaluate when you're making big and hard decisions along the way. Those are the people that you really want to rely on as you're doing that, to just help you maintain perspective, because you can go really into the weeds on this, and unfortunately there are people in the sport who are not going to have your best interest in mind. So it's good to just establish those relationships and that trust early on, and just have that kind of core circle of people around you as you go. Yeah, Nate, sorry.
Two on the business. No, don't apologize. I just trying to on the business side of stuff. Two, you should start, if you really want to do this as a pro, you should start building your audience now, because a lot of ways you get money are from sponsorships that are outside of how your team pays. And there's two ways to do it. One way is to win huge championships. The other way is to be a personality. And we see influencers who don't win anything, who just show up and do stuff, and they share their experience, and they get paid more money than professionals in the Tour de France, right?
Mhm.
And then I think too, if you're good at both, you don't even have to be the best. Like Lionel Sanders is a great example of this. People love him. He shares everything. He's got a huge following, and he is probably getting, I don't know this for sure, but he probably demands more money for sponsorship than some world champions do when he hasn't won a world championship yet. And that's just, I think a lot of pros don't realize that you really have to build, if you want to be successful long-term financially, and things make it a lot easier if you have money, I think, as a professional athlete, is to build that audience. And you're 15, start today.
Yeah. It
Yeah,
can't
couldn't
hurt,
agree more.
honestly. And building out relationships with personal sponsors is a really great way to kind of create a buffer against a lot of the instability that's inherent in the sport. So most of the time, especially in the women's side of the sport, which is what my experience was, but I think it's certainly true for many of the men, the contracts are year to year. So you don't have the security of saying like, okay, I've got this job for the next 3 years, 5 years. It's, you have 12 months to kind of prove yourself to that team and then earn another contract. And then here you are negotiating again and again and again. And a lot of that has nothing to do with your performance. Honestly, it can be the bad luck of a team losing a title sponsor, which has nothing to, like, maybe you just had the season of your life and, it's a tough year economically. So there aren't as many sponsors in the sport. I mean, we're kind of seeing that happen right now. So there is a lot of instability inherent in the way that this model works. You can buffer that a little bit by starting to develop some good relationships with sponsors and just, so in looking for personal sponsorships, remember that if you're going to get a contract with a team, the team is probably going to have sponsorships like bikes and clothing and shoes and things like that. Look for a coffee sponsor. Look for a grocery store chain sponsor. Look for non-endemic sponsors that aren't necessarily going to conflict with what a team might bring to the table. And then if you have those relationships, if something goes wrong with a team's budget, for example, you have a little bit of something that can create a buffer for you financially. And to that point, I will tell you one of the principles that has served me in my career is to remember that it is easier to keep a sponsor happy than it is to find a new sponsor. So when you do manage to break through and initiate a relationship with a new sponsor, do everything you can to make them happy. Do everything that you can to invest in those relationships, because the foundation of a successful and sustainable career in the sport is all about relationships. So don't burn bridges. Build relationships, invest in them, nurture them, and try to do that at the same time as doing the same thing for yourself. Cultivate and nurture your own enthusiasm for the sport and curiosity. And it's a lot. It's a lot to handle, but it is a really fun path.
Being on the other side of that too, I would over deliver if you can, because when it renews, that's a good chance to get more money. It's just like working for anybody. If you do the very bare minimum, like, don't expect them to be super happy at the end. If you're like, okay, this said I'm going to do this, this, and this, and you do that, and you're like, now give me a raise. Nobody wants that. And if it's the opposite side, they don't want to lose you, right? If you're giving all this extra value to them, and I think probably other brands will see that too. They could give you more and more money. So it's definitely sponsor management and sponsor, like, that's part of your job as an athlete. Another reason why being a pro athlete is so hard. There's so much to do.
Yeah. So the most important advice that I would add to that in terms of managing sponsorship is to be very clear about what their expectations are. Ask them exactly what they want, and then make sure you have a way of measuring whatever they need, and then track that. And then, like Nate said, over deliver on that. That's the most important thing, because it's very tempting for all of us athletes and teams and even companies in the industry to sit back and rest on our laurels and just assume that sponsorship just works out. But then what happens when contract renewal time comes around? Sponsors shift all the time, right? And it's very rare that you have a consistent sponsor. And in my opinion, it's because in those scenarios, people haven't been clear as far as what exactly they've expected and if it has been fulfilled, and nobody's tracking it anyway. So there is a situation where they got exactly what they needed and then they move on, and that's totally understandable, but it's much more common that isn't the case. And the big problem is that I find is that a lot of riders are afraid to do that because we have this fear that we might not be able to deliver what we are hoping to deliver in terms of value. But the fact is you can do it. Chances are you can, as long as you're making sound judgments, you can do it. So you just have to be very disciplined as far as saying, okay, this is exactly what you want. Okay, I will do it and I will measure it and I will update you on that. If you do that, sponsorship will stay there and it will grow. I promise. That's just how it works. Nate, go ahead.
I talked about the business podcast a little bit, and I have a whole list of things, and I think it's going to be on TikTok of little 1 minute stuff. But this is something in the book, Extreme Ownership, where they talk about managing up. And this is so important in all of business and inside of sponsorship, where you manage the person who's in charge of you or who is your sponsor. To give you an example is, what if every month you sent to your sponsor and said, here are the things I did in the last month. What can I do to improve? Are you happy with this? Okay. What if you do that in work too? You send to your boss, you say, in the last month, here's the things I achieved. Are you happy with this result? Can I do anything to improve? And you start with that conversation. Well, now your boss, your sponsor knows exactly what you're doing, and you've gotten a chance to improve and get some critical feedback, which is important for all of us to grow. And that way, when you get to the year at the end, to John's point, they're like, hey, so what happened this year? Well, hey, I've got 4 or 12 reports right here that I can say about all the value that I added. The whole time you said I was doing well, or I improved this whole time. It's really easy then to do your yearly review or to get signed up again. When at the end you go, what did you do? And I think for everybody, it's hard to remember what you did over a whole year, right? Like no one can think of it. But if you break it down into chunks, and to yourself too, you write down weekly or every time you do it. We do stand up so you can kind of reread those and stuff, but it really, really helps. And if you're feeling you're underappreciated at your job, try managing up by saying that. Say, here's what I did. What would you like me to improve on? I guarantee you that your management will appreciate you doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I'll follow up just real quickly on that. I think a lot of athletes have this misconception that I just need to win races and have a lot of followers on social media and I'll get all the sponsors. And it's not true. Like you need to be proactive about this, and to exactly what these guys are saying, you need to go out and have conversations with these sponsors, and you need to A, do your homework, and B, listen to what they actually need to come up with how you can deliver value that's actually going to be relevant to the sponsor. And it's going to be different for every single sponsor. And one of the advantages that you have as an individual athlete over, say, a team is you can be really agile with this. So send all of your sponsors a weekly update. Even if you didn't have any events, talk about the training you did, talk about maybe some of the topics that you did post on social media. Social media is an important component of this, but it's not the end all be all. Your goal is to not just do things, not just get results, not just post things, but to magnify the impact of everything you do in a way that benefits your sponsor. And how it benefits your sponsor is going to be different for every sponsor, because every sponsor is going to need something different depending on what their business model is, depending on what their product is. So do a lot of listening, be willing to pivot, which you can do much more easily as an individual athlete than what a team can. So you can be really adaptive to changing needs of your sponsor, adaptive to their feedback throughout the season, week to week even, and then just make them feel a part of your story. So everything that these guys are saying is really important too. So these are things to start thinking about. You're 15, you maybe, don't feel like you need to dive in and do everything at once, but just that principle of under promise and over deliver is a really good one. And then, just remember to continually take care of and tend to all the relationships that you build in the sport.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to rapid fire through a few more because we got a ton. I mean, we're already going long here. Might as well commit to it and go full send. So this one is from Edward Walker. He says, I purchased a road bike yesterday and would like to start training. Congrats, Edward. That's cool. He says, I'm 42 and a black male. Cycling was never introduced to me in my culture. What training regime can I start now? So first of all, Edward, it's not dependent, experience is not a determining factor in terms of what you should start right off the bat. You can start training now. We've talked about this plenty of times, whether you should, train to start training. It seems kind of crazy when you say it that way, right? But you can jump in right now and go ahead and start training. In terms of the cultural aspect though, I just personally want to thank Justin, Corey, Williams, the Legion team for I think like opening up like a pretty big blind spot that our sport has had for quite a long time. I have seen, Nate, have you noticed this too? Like when racing was happening this year, I saw a way more diversity at our road racing scene than I have seen in previous years. And it's been going that way for a couple years now. And I can't help but think that they have an influence on it. So I would,
sure.
yeah, so I would follow them, Legion of Los Angeles and Justin, Corey, Dante, the whole team. That really it's a good group that is changing the perspective on that, and hopefully they can provide some more relatable points for you, just coming from a different culture than what the majority of the sport resides within many times. So that would be my advice. But you can start training right now, man. No need to wait. Another question from Peter: would you recommend the Element Roam or Edge 530 for outdoor workouts? Both are good and they have different strengths. It's super cool on the Element how you can just scroll from back and forth in your workout with the arrows right there. But now with the Edge units, with the 530, you can't get like the new data fields that are really helpful that you get. Actually, no, with the 530 you totally can. So yeah,
you can.
Yep. So it's awesome. You can go onto our blog and we have a whole blog article on how to use it. I've used both. I like both. I've even used my Garmin watch. I like that too. Honestly, it's not like you're going to be an advantage or disadvantage one over the other. Another one, how much carbs should we fuel for training rides that are 1 to 1.5 hours and how much for 2 hours or 3 hours? Nate, probably break it down by time and a rate that you take in, I would assume would be your suggestion.
Well, think about your overall training, the intensity. Do you have a hard day the next day? Are you trying to lose weight? All that sort of stuff takes into account. So if you're obese and it's not intense, it would be a different recommendation than if you're in a high volume plan. You got a huge workout tomorrow. You did a huge workout the previous week, and you're raising volume in your training, right? So, I mean, at the max, 90 to 100. I personally do that. I have a high FTP. I put out a whole bunch of watts, and I have a bunch of intensity during the week, and I'm raising my volume. And I'm not concerned about lowering my body fat right now. And I'm trying to be good for crit nationals. Like all of those kind of things make me want to be able to use as many carbs as quickly as possible inside of a race. When I go to DK, I probably don't have enough time to change anything in that 6 weeks. So I'm probably going to do extremely high carb at the same time. We've covered this many, many, many times in the podcast. I don't know, Chad, do you have anything to add to this, to tweak what I just said?
Not really. You about summed it up when you said it's tremendously subjective. I mean, working at 60% versus working at 90% has a very different requirement in terms of carbohydrate intake.
And then last one that we'll cover here says, should we do a new ramp test if you're going to stay somewhere at a significant change in altitude? It depends. Like you totally can, or you can use just like the adjustment, so to speak, for FTP and kind of like so if you look up, there's a chart, and I believe that it's a Coggin created chart. I could be wrong though. And it basically kind of like goes through and assimilates basically like what acclimated, what percentage of FTP you could expect to be able to ride at sea level to a different elevation. So you could use that and just try to adjust, or that's the benefit of the ramp test. It's really not that hard to be able to do, and it doesn't, ruin you for a day or anything like that. So you can absolutely. But if you change elevation, you do have to change your FTP in some regard, one way or another, whether you do it manually or with a test. So, Nate,
and just know too, if you're going really high from like say sea level to 7,000 feet, it's gonna after 3 weeks or so, it's gonna change again, even with or without training. So just be aware of that. So you might do one test, and then after 4-week block, that's probably a really good time then to do another test. And that might be your true elevation adjusted FTP.
Yep. Yeah. Why go off of a chart when you can actually figure it out, right? So yeah, good point. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks for joining us on the live stream on YouTube. Once again, if you are watching right now, please go give this a thumbs up right now. If you do that, it'll help this video a ton, and a ton of people will see it. I think Nate's looking over at it right now, so he's going to watch your thumbs. Please give them.
There's always 2 people who thumbs down. Like the other test, there was like 1,000 upvotes, and then one person's like, nope. I want to know who keeps tuning in every time and gives the thumbs down.
Contrarians. And then also, if you're listening on the podcast, thank you so much, and share this podcast. That would be a great way to help us. So share it with the cyclists that you know that are just like you, probably locked down right now and in need of some cycling content to help them get faster and keep the motivation high. With all of that, we will talk to you all next week at the normal time, Thursday, 8 a.m. Pacific. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.